a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told it's part of getting older? You just go to americhealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done. And then from there, get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. americhealth.com/table talk. The discount code is table talk. Today's episode is brought to you by First Detachment. Are you looking for a supplement brand that truly understands hardworking athletes? Look no further than First Detachment. 1D's real world experience is what I would consider, and they consider, battle tested. I have known Justin Harris for pretty close to 2 decades. And if there's anybody that I trust with nutritional and supplement needs, it's Justin Harris. If you guys have followed me and have followed the podcast, you pretty much already know how I feel about the supplement industry. For me to get behind any brand, I have to trust the brand and I have to trust the person both. And I'm pretty sure you guys all know why. When it comes to creating formulas and putting products on the market, and there's nobody that I trust more than Justin Harris. While I love all of their products, I'd suggest that you check out the Field Rations and WTH first. Go to www.firstdetachment.com and use the code TABLETALK10 to save 10% off each order. The link is in the description. Today's episode is brought to you by Element, a tasty electrolyte drink mix with everything that you need and nothing that you don't. In other words, no sugar, no artificial coloring, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, and no BS. With Element, I love the watermelon. The watermelon tastes freaking awesome. I drank 1 pack every day, no matter what. People that train out here, it's sitting out here for them all the time. The boxes don't last very long. Right now, Element is offering Table Talk listeners a free sample pack with any purchase. That's 8 single serving packages free with any Element order. Get yours at drinkelement.com/table talk. The deal is only available through the link in the description. The other thing is, if you don't like it, you can just give it away to a salty friend and Element will give you a 100% refund. No risk, money back guarantee. Head over to drinkelement.com/table talk.
Today's episode is brought to you by EliteFTS.com. Founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of us for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate. We are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. What's going on, guys? We are back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guest is Brett Bartholomew. Pronounce that right?
Yes, you did.
Okay. The best-selling author, keynote speaker, professional coach, lifelong student, author of Art of Coaching. I have just bullet points here because you're more than all that, right?
No problem.
Yeah,
I'm not that type of guy.
Exactly. So what I want to do is I don't want to go all the way back in your timeline, but just really quickly summarize the strength and conditioning background. I believe it's 17 years, right? Or
15. Yeah, just over 15 now.
So 15 years, and that was in the college sector?
College, private, all the above.
Okay, and are you still doing that now?
No, now we've transitioned based on what the book and our work does now. We work with organizations all over the world on power dynamics, communication, social agility, but still work with a lot of sporting organizations. But in terms of me training athletes athletes now? No, now running a company, scaling that, and trying to coach coaches.
Cool. That's what I wanted to get into and wanted to push it as close to the front end of this as I can, so people can be anchored with exactly what we're going to talk about and the value of communication throughout all spheres. Yeah. Right. So before getting into that, without getting too deep into the weeds with that, going all the way back into your childhood or hospitalization, because that does set context, I believe, for what you're doing now.
Without a doubt.
Wrap up what happened there and walk me through it a little bit.
Sure. The half-life your message of this is, I nearly lost my life in part due to poor communication and power dynamics. Spent a year of my life in the hospital. This was due to a lot of issues that, as a teenager, I went through a phase where my parents were going through a pretty nasty divorce. A lot of my close friends got into hardcore drugs. At 13, 14, I wasn't equipped to know how to deal with a lot of that change. So I channeled that into training. Training became a drug. Well, I didn't really follow great advice. I'm doing low carb, low fat, all these things that were popular at the time. I'm training as a means to stay out of the house, just deal with a lot of anxiety, anger, depression, and that led me to being hospitalized. And this hospital is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. You're stuck on the 8th floor. You can't exercise. You're weighed every day. Blood's checked every day. You are sat in a day room with plexiglass. It's just an awful environment, right? So I basically learned a lot about human nature, power dynamics, being in this environment with 6 to 8 other individuals who all had stories of their own. One was a junior Olympic wrestler who was beaten by his father, didn't make weight, so developed anorexia nervosa. Another one was a 68-year-old woman who was left by her husband. Long story short, my body, I was near heart, kidney, and liver failure. To get out of this hospital, I had to basically refeed, gain a crap ton of weight. And so when I did get released, and again, I'm giving massive Reader's Digest version, we can go deeper. I knew, okay, I want to learn everything I can about training the body the right way. So went to college, got a degree in exercise physiology, master's in motor learning, all these things, started working in collegiate strength and conditioning, eventually the private sector, mainly with professional athletes, special forces, combat athletes, all of that. Well, what I started to realize is what I loved most, I love the training and we can still nerd out on those things, but I love the people side, the power dynamics, the messy realities, the difficult personalities, because that's what I identified with. When I was in the hospital, because I didn't fit this classic characterization of the kinds of folks that were in there, somebody that was, I'm scared of food, I'm scared of this. I had deeper issues that nobody ever cared to really understand. Well, it's the same with all these athletes. It's the same with anybody listening. People have shit in their lives. Nobody really knows how to get to the bottom of it. That became an addiction for me to figure those things out. So now we built a company off of that, helping people with the messy realities of leadership coaching in life.
So when you're in school and the strength coach journey began, you started as an intern, I assume. Yeah. So how many years were you in the internship?
So I did a 6-month internship at Athletes Performance Institute down in Pensacola, Florida. That gave me a wide range of experience working with everything from kids to, I remember, working with Manny Ramirez, a lot of Trot Nixon, a guy that wanted me to put, a splash of vodka in his pre-workout shooter, just salt of the earth, awesome guy, amazing. Trot, don't get mad at me if you hear this. And then I went and interned at the University of Nebraska under James Dobson and Chad Wade. Did that for another 6 months. And then after that, became a graduate assistant at Southern Illinois University under Jared Nesland. And the greatest thing about that is I could get my degree in motor learning while coaching nonstop. So overall, helped oversee 8 teams. So traditionally, right, baseball, football, basketball. And then over the course of my time there, I was in charge of baseball, men's and women's tennis, men's and women's swimming and diving, the dance team, all that. And then that led into my first full-time job in the private sector, overseeing a combination at the Andrews Institute in Pensacola, Special Forces, where I met my wife working with them, and then oversaw the professional sports side of things.
All right, so your time in the collegiate sector was also your time working on the extra degrees, the master's degrees.
Yeah, without a doubt, yeah.
And then that breaks off and you're in the private sector. Is your education still continuing at that time?
So technically I finished my master's dissertation while I was working full time because I got the job while I was in the last kind of few months of all my master's degree. I mean, it wasn't a hard decision, right? I loved the collegiate environment, but I had remembered I had applied for 3 jobs at the time because my GA was coming to an end, right? two of those jobs. One was Colorado State, one was Arizona State. I remember both coaches one was an HR kind of. Colorado State was like, thanks, it's filled. Arizona State had just fired their strength coach. So then this private sector job came up, and they're like, we can give you a lot of experience. You can travel the world, train a lot of different kinds of athletes, military. We're going to throw you into the fire. I'm like, no brainer. No brainer. Gonna do that. Sorry, I'll finish my paper, after. So go into the private sector environment. And, for me, that was amazing because you had to code switch a lot, Dave. Yeah. Right? Like what at one moment we're working with surgeons as part of the fellowship to the Andrews Institute. They got free training. The next I have to work with wounded warriors or members of the Eagle Fund who had gotten blown up downrange. Now I'm working with a guy, and this is funny. You've talked about this. People have all these training biases. I remember one time I'm working with a dual amputee. And I had posted something on social media about, a training modality I was using. Some jackass says, well, you should know that's not the force output, that using this version would be. You shouldn't be using machines. And I go, this is a dual amputee. Yeah. Don't tell me what you think you know. Yeah. And then you'd have to code switch to pro athletes, to kids, and all groups, right? And you didn't have a lot of help. So, I loved my time in the collegiate side, and this is nothing against that, but you got a lot of help.
Yeah.
You do. You got a lot of help. I mean, there's some strength coaches that got 5 assistants. And I just say that because as we moved on to the communication side of things and power dynamics, you'd get some coaches that were like, I have 150 athletes. I don't have time to get to know them all.
Yes.
I'm like, what's your job?
And there's that's where I was trying to get at, is there's a difference there that me being on the private sector pretty much my entire life is one thing. When I was developing the business and coming up through the business, I'm looking through different resources for leadership, right? Because it's a small company, you have a small number of employees.
Right.
And of course I'm going to go towards, Vince Lombardi. I'm going to go towards the sport demographic for leadership. Even other strength coaches in high positions, like, how do you do this? How does this work? How's that work? And then they explain it to me, and I get some of it, and I'd be like, this isn't going to work in a private sector.
Yeah.
And the one conversation I was having, I can't remember who the coach was now. I said, well, here's the difference as I see it. And I would love your feedback on this because this is your area of expertise, and you also lived in both of these worlds, right? Now, when I come in, it's not like my customer service has a backup waiting to take her job when she goes to go to the bathroom.
Yep.
And then that backup doesn't have another backup. So when I have to motivate, I have to motivate somebody with no pressure coming up underneath for that spot.
Sure.
Where now your center has one center just waiting while they're team members, just waiting for their opportunity to go in there to show that other person up.
Yeah.
That's different dynamic when it comes to how are you going to motivate, incentivize somebody to do the work.
Yeah.
And that's where all of a sudden all those resources didn't mesh really well. Cause I'm like, how? Then it's like, okay, well, what do you, and you did it. Okay, this is the cool thing.
Yeah.
Then what do you do when you no longer are in that demographic?
Yep.
Then boom, you're going to get pulled out of that, D1 level where everybody's fighting for every position.
Sure.
And now you go train Gen Pop.
Yeah.
How's that work?
Yeah. Well, one, just to touch on something you said, it highlights the point that, there is no one size fits all. And this is something that I think the strength and conditioning world in totality has struggled with for a very long time. They want almost the equivalent of a Prilipin's chart to deal with every situation, right? They want it's a field that's so used to operating off scripts and, this input equals that output, so on and so forth. No, all these things are contextual. And you're right, you do have to adapt those styles, in the collegiate environment. And to build off of what you said, if an athlete didn't do what we needed them to do, eventually we can go to the head sport coach, and they're going to get their ass in line, and the thing that I did appreciate about the private sector, and I liked them both. So I want to make it sure that all the YouTube commenters know I'm not this guy that wants to go college, private, but people get into that, right? The field gets off on that. But in the private sector, when I have a guy that's worth $100 million giving me money, but I have to tell him to do things he inherently doesn't always want to do, those power dynamics are a little bit different, right? And so to find those different driving factors and motivators, however you want to look at that, that takes skill, that takes nuance, and you've got to be a little bit more creative in that private side. You've got to kind of get people going in different ways. ways. Does that answer your question?
It does answer my question. What I'm interested in is that when you started to realize that there's a big difference, obviously, there's a big difference between individuals,
sure,
but there's a big difference in communication in regards to, say, demographics.
Yeah. When I realized there was a huge difference was just that time working predominantly with professional athletes that were coming to pay. They were paying customers, right? Yeah. And there were 75 of them that are paying, and you've got to manage those egos and attitudes. And by the way, they're all on different teams. So you can't use the quotidian leadership like one goal, one mission, one this. One guy wants to sit there and say it's a contract year. I want to get my money. Another guy's like, I've had back-to-back seasons of injuries. I got something to prove. Another guy is this. You have 14 different driving factors there, right? So all of a sudden you start seeing, all right, how are they responding to teaching and cueing and whatever? Well, a lot of it came back to some of their selfish desires and fears, which we have. We're all human. We ignore this part about human nature. And so that's when I started realizing it is like, you can't coach this like you can in where it's like, hey, everybody's fighting for the same school. Everybody's, and even in the collegiate environment, you're going to have that too. I recognize that, right? I'm not going to sit here and say the farm kid from rural Iowa had the same motivating factors as a kid from Dade County. Of course that doesn't happen, but they're not paying, right? They're not paying. So you're not only dealing with different drives, you're dealing with the contextual factor of they're a customer. They have say, and by the way, they can go anywhere. And so to codify that point, somebody once said to me, well, the only reason because I wrote Conscious Coaching when I was 30. And somebody said, well, the only reason you've trained so many pro athletes is, because you worked at this private sector facility. And I said, time out. These people had a choice to go anywhere that they want. I could easily say, if you're the Arizona Cardinals head strength coach, I'm pulling this out. This has nothing to do with their strength coach. They don't have a choice. Like in season, they've got to train with you. They can have their guy or whatever. So coaches the overall message, Dave, is like coaches, I just realized you have to flex, you have to bend like Semper Gumby, right? Like there's no one size fits all way. And it is your job to figure out what they want and how to kind of cater that message and tailor it.
Yeah, if the fire was always started when you were a kid, right? And they're trying to figure the communication thing out. What I'm trying to figure out is when did that fire become an inferno or a passion? Yes, that we all get geeked out on the strength and conditioning parameters, periodization, all those type of things. And you have to do that for a certain period if that's the job that you're in. But at some point, the scales tipped for you. And it was like communication, this is it. Then all your eggs go in that basket as far as passion and so forth. What was the catalyst for that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the hospitalization, being like treated as a one size fits all symptom, right? I think where it all came together and coalesced was probably about the age of 27 when I realized my motor learning research, which was on attentional focus and cueing, and an understanding that human interaction is an example of a complex adaptive system, right? That tied very much into my interest of agility and many other things. So I started saying, all right, there's this experience at the hospital. There's these experiences I'm having training this wide demographic of athletes, and then also getting to teach internationally. And then there was this stuff that I did with motor learning. I'm like, holy shit, this all feeds together. I'm going to start teaching people social agility. And I think I had this unconscious competence, right? I had kind of this breakdown, and this will answer your question. I apologize if it took me a while to get there. I was trying to suss it out. One time it was a year where we were supposed to get, we were doing our staff review. And I was trying to get an idea of where do I need to improve as a coach? And we kind of got generic feedback. So I remember I'm at this layover in Denver, Colorado. I'm stuck in the airport. And I'm like, I didn't get much feedback. Why the hell do I do what I do? What am I good at? Why do I care about it? All this stuff. And I went down this rabbit hole. And I asked some of our guys, my athletes, I go, why do you come to me? Oh, well, the training, you get results. I'm like, yeah, but a lot of people can do that. Like I'm competitive there, but why? And it was about the fifth or sixth time I had asked it. And Don Terry Poe of the Kansas City Chiefs at the time goes, bro, it's the way you explain stuff. It's the way that you seek to kind of get in our heads and make this matter to us. And that dawned on me. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I care about these things because of this. Why isn't there any coach education on this? What does the research say about that? And it started this whole rabbit hole that coalesced all these experiences together to say, this is what I'm going to double and triple down on. So what, like the inciting incident was the hospitalization. The codifying moment of everything was about at 27, where I realized all these things intersected to my interest in human nature and communication.
This becomes interesting then, because when you start going down that path, you're getting backlash because of that, right? Because of this direction that you're going, which was always interesting to me. And, I kind of heard it back then, but it didn't give a fuck enough to pay attention to it. But then as going through the materials for this, it kind of reignited that. And, I remember thinking that this is so stupid, right? Because where do the coaches go? They do what I did. Like, they're going to go read Lombardi's book. They're going to read all this. They're going to read books that are kind of on communication, but kind of not.
No.
And they're going to read other types of books like Jocko's book and stuff like that, which are kind of on communication, but kind of not. Yeah. Where I always kind of liked those trade books, but if I wanted answers, I always wanted to go to like Communication 101, like a textbook.
Sure.
Like, get rid of the stories for me and just get to the textbook, like what's in there. But the fascinating thing to me was, and I think in some of your past podcasts, you mentioned the word sellout, which that was always a funny thing to me because, of course, coming up in a business sector, that's always there as well. And in the college sector, that made me laugh actually out loud as I was listening to it, right? Because the whole dynamic of the athlete coming to the university for a visit, they're going to recruit the athlete. They're going to take him in this weight room that specifically, if you be completely honest, is completely designed for recruiting.
100%.
100%.
Yeah.
Otherwise, none of the shit needs to be painted, colored, branded, none of that. It's all for the recruiting, which essentially is all the people that are saying that what you're doing, this is a sellout, they're all working it for the biggest sellouts in the fucking, so to me, it's just an excuse to not look at, first off, because in your book, that you got to look inside before you can really start to help outside. And that's hard for some people to do.
Yep.
It's very hard for people to do. So that's that first excuse to not do that, to try to keep things a little simple. And it also, and I'm just going off coaches that I've spoken to.
Sure.
When I had to move into the Gen Pop sector to train, Gen Pop, that was a little bit different than all the gyms that I've trained my entire life as a meathead. Way different.
Yeah.
I was like,
yeah.
There was a big culture shock too. So that became this big rabbit hole of like, how can I communicate with these people? Because even if I don't necessarily care, that's a loosely, probably shitty way to say it.
I get what you mean.
It's still my income to be able to allow me to keep powerlifting at the time. And I don't want to have to keep finding new clients. And I never was able to understand how personal trainers or coaches didn't think that spending more time in this aspect mattered, because as you spoke about Prelipin's chart and stuff like that, that's not a holy grail by any means. There's no metric in strength and conditioning that's tested or measured that can give you actual quantifiable dynamic correspondence to what happens on the field.
Yeah.
But becoming more connected with this blows my mind, by the way, right? Because I'm making a very long time, I'm jumping all over the place too, where the coach's ability to get all those players to work together is one.
Yeah.
Far exceeds any other ability that they have.
Yeah.
And I've seen it firsthand. I know I'm being a little lengthy, but
no, you're fine.
The one aspect of this is I've been to a lot of different schools to observe the training that they do, the coaches' training. And a few years ago, I went to one, and I've told this story a couple times before. The training was, in my opinion, awful. Just awful. Terrible. Forced reps on hammer strength machines. I mean, and not like hit training force reps, like volume with force reps.
Sure,
I could give multiple reasons why this is just bad, right? And then as I was driving home, I'm thinking to myself that this was really, really bad. But at the same time, I've never seen small pods of athletes, 4 or 5, work together as they did.
Yep.
The teamwork that I saw in that facility on that day was far in excess of the teamwork and camaraderie I saw in any university beforehand. And that's probably 30 or 40 different university trips. And then it hit me, this is why this team is routinely in the top 10.
Sure.
It's not the training. It's whatever that coach has built culture-wise in there. And every coach knows this.
Yeah.
Right? Every trainer knows this as well. But the fact that they don't want to look into it blows my mind. And some people, I guess maybe it's genetic. Some people just kind of fall into it without having to look into it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you give me a lot of really good anchor points to go off of that I think can add value to your statements. So if you'll allow me to. One, it caught me off guard too, and I'm glad that you mentioned kind of the sellout thing and all that. And I probably haven't gone as deep into this as I will here to honor your listeners. But yeah, that was tough for me. And what I mean by it is this. When I wrote this book, I started at 27, 28. I think it came available to the public at 29 or 30. And you did see that. There was this like 10%. Sometimes in my mind, I made it more people than it really was. But there was this 10% of coaches that were really angry. Oh, sell out. You're supposed to be behind the scenes strength. It's not about us. It's about this, whatever. And what does a 30-year-old know about this? And here's the thing. It's interesting when people tie experience to age. You know, like Forbes can have a 30 out of 30 where they celebrate people of all ages doing things, but in strength and conditioning, nah. Like experience isn't really tied to age. It provides the opportunity for insight. Yes, being older does, but that's kind of like people can read books. That provides the opportunity to extract wisdom. That doesn't guarantee that you're going to do so. And we know some people have been a certain age and all they've done is flick on a light and done the same thing the same way for X amount of years. But I got a lot of backlash because of my age, which was interesting because I didn't get that when I went to speak or consult in other industries. They don't care. They just wanted solutions. But as you know, strength and conditioning has been a lot of crabs in the bucket for a long time. Why? Because it's a lot of competitive people that have, a fair amount of insecurity, and we all do, that got into a field with, they have a chip on their shoulder. Like it's a hyper competitive, who's the best, who's this, who's that kind of field. Another thing that was interesting is when I started talking about communication, to your point exactly, you would have thought that anybody selling training thought I was coming for their market share. If they had a course on training or if they had a book, like what I mean by this is I remember posting about this stuff and somebody goes, so you're saying training is not important? I'm like, listen, I can like Chinese food and also really enjoy pizza. No, me saying that communication, which is inextricably linked to the coaching process, it's the foundational quality of it. It's also why we as human beings are on the top of the food chain. We're the most complex social animal in the world. You're a very strong man. You're not as strong as a silverback, right? Even at my fastest, I'm not as fast as a cheetah. We're the preeminent social animal on the planet, right? So me saying that these things are important and underrepresented and having done the research, there's people out there like Robin Jones and so many others that have talked about we need more facilitated outputs for communication. People thought that I was saying that training is not important. No. Of course it's important. Like, where is that the question? The other thing is, and just coming full circle on this, I remember one time at a conference, somebody saying, well, communication's not quantifiable. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. Communication is one of the most quantifiable things there is. And they're trying to compare it to training. If I do a 12-week program with this and this and this, I can see X, Y, and Z happen. I'm like, well, that's making some assumptions there. We've seen a lot of great training programs written where we didn't get the adaptations because of numerous factors, and that. But then I start pulling research from the marketing world. And I go, do you think Coca-Cola spends $100 million on an ad collectively or $10 million on a 30-second ad spot because they don't have any actual data? Or in 2015, U.S. hospitals lost $12 billion due to lawsuits that were underpinned by poor communication, poor bedside manner. You have analytics related to communication and human behavior all around us. It's what drives the world. We're social. And so it dawned on me, okay, this field, when you look at some of the research out there, why do people fear change? The field started to just feel like, all right, there's all these other areas we feel like we've got to improve. Now you're telling me one more. And by the way, if you tell me I can improve my deadlift technique, okay, that's been normalized. I don't take that personally. You're telling me I change the influence tactic or the way I address this power dynamic or the way I communicate this. There's a lot of coaches that now take that personally. They think that's an affront on them personally. And we found a 2016 meta-analysis that showed out of 285 coach development programs, and this includes sport coaching, fewer than 6% focused on any interpersonal skills or intra. And the ones that did, to your point about the books, were on transformational leadership. Well, guess what? I'm all for transformational leadership, servant-based leadership and all that. But some of the people we coach are narcissists and they don't want to be told, they don't want us to address them like Mother Teresa or John Wooden. There's a lot of different coaching styles. You got to use the right damn gear for the right hill. And so me too, like I just felt like every leadership book I read, it was like the 12 principles for this, be positive, be this. That wasn't communication tactics and strategies to me. And by the way, even conscious coaching was just a conversation starter. The amount we've changed and gone into the weeds sense of then, and that'll be the next book. It's just like there's deeper stuff here. So we wanted to go into the research. And the last thing I'll say is this and turn it back to you, but I just wanted to go full circle with
please.
it. Is people don't understand, with conscious coaching, there was a limitation on how much we could write. So we wanted to put a fair amount of research in there to say, hey, this is vetted stuff. I think there's 84 to 85 references. But the goal here is also to create something for a larger population that doesn't feel non-accessible. So I'm not going to go. I remember one time I was writing it and my editor goes, are you writing a doctoral dissertation or something that you actually want people to read? And he's like, because you're writing this pretty defensively. And I'm like, you're right. So, sometimes things have to be commercialized and quote unquote dumbed down a bit to start a conversation. And then you have layers of things. It's just like periodization, right? Like you don't start with the most complex training tactics. You start with this and this and this. And we're dealing with it now with the second book. The publisher says, hey, the goal is to read. You have 300 pages to make your point, right? You've got to use, because I'm with you, I don't want a ton of stories after a while. Now they're forcing me, I do have to include some of those. But the point is I didn't understand where all this fear, because I was 30, this fear because this communication, we're talking about communication, something that people need to work on. This fear of, then some people want to make it a private sector thing versus a team sector thing. I'm like, guys, I hate to tell you, these other professions don't care. When I speak for the military and Microsoft, they have Microsoft had their sales folks, the people that help build the cloud, their construction workers. It is a human being thing. Learn it. But I think it just speaks to overall, you've seen, we have to get to this era in strength and conditioning that is more collaborative, less non-zero sum, less, like people just have to wake up and take a look at themselves and be like, okay, I just look at my relationships. I look at all these things. Maybe I should ask, where am I the problem, and be more open to working on this stuff.
The interesting thing was when you were saying that your competitors would look at what you were doing and didn't like it, is if I go back a decade when I first would stumble across different marketing means and marketing influence, the type influence tactics, there's a time I'd be like, I'm not going to go out there and talk about what influence tactics I'm using, because that would just help my competitors to know, okay, here's what I could do. And that was before I realized they still have to do it. That's a whole nother thing.
They won't.
But meanwhile, you're giving this stuff out. Like, it's like, here you go. And they're trying to weaponize that against you. Meanwhile, you're actually giving them tools to be able to compete better with you.
Yeah.
It's influence.
And not only that, Dave, I remember when I tried to get conscious coaching, I was talking to a publisher and he says, my job's to sell books, right? A friend had introduced us. And he basically said, I have no idea what strength and conditioning is. He's like, I have no idea what that is. Like, I this is going to be a hard book to market because I don't get this, and so I start realizing, another thing that I found odd is, and you mentioned Jocko Willink. When you look at leadership books, there's examples of folks in the military that have crossed over. There's examples of folks in the medical world that have crossed over. There's not that many examples of folks in strength and conditioning, that have crossed over. And so I remember looking at my wife, and one night I was pretty upset, to the point of tears, because I'm like, I'm genuinely trying to do something good here. I'm trying to create an avenue where I think a lot of coaches know more. I think a lot of coaches have a lot to give, and I'm trying to create an avenue like Jay-Z and certain people do for other musicians to expand their bandwidth into other things. And instead, I'm being vilified because I'm young and because the book did really well. And again, I had to be smart about realizing there was far more people for me than against me. Usually the people against you are kind of the back channel-y ones. And when you hear somebody down talking somebody else, you're like, all right, what's really at play here? But I'm just like, I'm trying to give you more opportunities. But just hearing from the publisher being like, no, I don't know what strength and conditioning is. I don't believe there's an audience for that. This is different if it's corporate America and whatever. And I just remember, well, screw you. And then again, thankfully it crossed over anyway. But if I could have reached out to strength coaches at the time and been like, hey, you guys all argue about all this stuff. The larger world doesn't even understand what we do. It doesn't. I mean, when I spoke at Wells Fargo, these guys, and that's not a flex, it's me saying a bunch of financial analysts, when I said, I showed a picture of athletes trying to get on the same page of, how the concepts I was going to talk to them about related to what they did. I go, this is assets under management. These people have huge contracts. We've got to make sure that we mitigate the risk of injury as much as we can and amplify performance, return on investment, so to speak. And one guy came up to me and he goes, I just assumed that these people kind of worked with personal trainers. I didn't know that there was a profession like yours. So it's just like trying to get strength coaches to quit thinking smaller. And that starts with analyzing their own behavior, understanding human behavior, and actually being willing to work on it. Something that, I mean, how have you been? You've been vulnerable for a long time, going back to all your books, all your articles. Like, I'd love to ask you, where was that inciting incident to you where you're like, you know what? I'm pretty confident in myself. I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm actually a lifelong learner. I don't have time for bullshit. Feed me.
It's probably more simple than that. It was probably more than, I'm not going to remember how to tell a lie over and over again. So if I just be who I am, from the start, then I'm never going to have to worry about that.
Yeah.
I think a big part of that's kind of where that came from. And the vulnerability, I don't know if I ever really saw it as that, right? Because with my upbringing, it was more, just being pushed down, being told I was something that I was not, or maybe I was to that person. That's their interpretation.
Right.
But realizing that that's not who I really was. And there's other people out there that may be in that same mental space that I could be able to help them to be able to see they're not their label. They can label themselves. And so that was a part of it, but obviously this emerges and grows over a period of time. Yeah. With each piece of adversity that I've run into, I'm very big on accountability. Like whatever the adversity is, for whatever the reason, I'm responsible for that.
Yeah.
So I need to figure out, why am I responsible for this? When I was younger, that was hard, right? Because everybody else is responsible, right? And I don't know what flipped that. That I can't really go back and pinpoint. And I've tried, because I like to try to figure out why, what these little catalysts are, these little bumps, because obviously it started before that turned.
Yep.
But that point, that change point, defining moment point, intrigues the shit out of me for a lot of reasons. And I'm not really sure why. I don't know if it's because I want to be able to do that for somebody else, to be able to avoid maybe some of the mistakes that I had, or maybe it's just me fucking with my own head, wondering if there's other ones I haven't flicked yet.
Sure.
Yeah,
so. But I would challenge you respectfully on one thing. There's this tool called the Johari window that was created by two social psychologists. The whole goal was to make it easier for people to build trust and work in teams. It was created for corporations. And one of the things, without going into the weeds, is, you build trust by putting certain things into what they called the open window. Stuff that I know that I'm now sharing with you.
Yeah.
So for example, it could be something as banal as, hey, Dave, I'm married and my wife's name's Liz. Cool. That goes in the open window. So for you to be willing to put things in the open window is vulnerability. Vulnerability isn't like a touchy-feely. A lot of it is just information sharing.
Yeah.
So I would say the fact that you were even open about your past in general is that vulnerability. And where I'm going with this is, when you try to get people to understand power dynamics and the ethical use of influence, one of the most potent power bases you can use is what's called referent power, this concept of relatability. And you see this in the world. There are plenty of subject matter experts out there, but they're not really relatable. And then on the other hand, we have a lot of charlatans that are really relatable. Well, there's an intersection. You can actually know what you're talking about and be a relatable person.
Yes.
And so you have been an example of that.
Yeah.
By you being willing to put some things out there, that's an anchor point, an invitation for other people that have kind of been through stuff to say, hey, this is kind of what I went through. And by the way, this is what it led to. Well, you're unique in your own right, but the world's filled with 8 billion people. Chances are there's a lot of people that can resonate with that. Yeah. And they wouldn't have found your work and supported your mission if it wasn't those things. So, just even a coach's ability to be vulnerable. Think how many, and I will poke at college strength coaches here a little bit. It was, and myself included, it can be an uptight atmosphere. And you're asking a lot of athletes to look at you, and a lot of strength coaches, first in, last out, tucked in shirt, all this. Well, what about that is, like, if you don't ever share anything with somebody else, what do you expect them to share with you? And then a devil's advocate, one guy was like, well, it's not my job to run group therapy sessions. I'm like, who the hell is saying that? I'm saying periodically sharing a little. We just did something with the University of Tennessee, and one of their athletes, I go, how do you trust me? I started the whole talk. I go, what would make you trust me right now? One of the athletes goes, tell me a secret. I go, what do you mean? She goes, tell me something about yourself. Give me a reason to trust you. Put skin in the game. And, some of the coaches there, and this was swimming and diving, and I give them huge props. They've won a ton of championships. One of them said, I don't do a good enough job of that. They know nothing about me, my past struggles, yet I expect them to listen to every single thing that I say. There's a difference between commitment and compliance.
Yes.
Commitment does not happen at a consistent level if there's a massive asymmetry in information. It is not about being Oprah and these big moments. It's about literally drip feeding this stuff over time so there's reciprocal influence. Because to your point, again, that's where a lot of those leadership books fail. Leadership isn't about a person. It's about you, the stakeholders, meaning the other people involved, not followers, stakeholders, because that's not passive. The context, right? What's the organization you're in? What's the time period? It's this amorphous organism that's always shifting, because otherwise it just takes one really influential follower for leadership to fail. It does.
Yeah.
And you see this throughout history. You see this when Lincoln created a team of rivals. And so people forget this interactive process that actually is leadership, not one enigmatic person, great man, Queen Elizabeth, whatever. It's a messy full contact sport. But if you don't share, if you don't have any vulnerability, don't be mad when these people don't open up to you or don't follow your lead at all.
That's just building trust, right? I mean, everybody knows that to some degree. There has to be a certain degree of trust. But before we even get there, they still have to have trust in themselves.
Yeah.
Right? Which is to get back to, what they can do to be able to look within is where, with people that I'll mentor and consult with, that's where the biggest connect is, because they don't take the time. They know what they stand against, but they don't know what they stand for.
Yep.
Right. It's very easy for them to point out what they stand against.
That's a great point.
And, but when you start to get them to dig into the weeds a little bit to figure out what their own core values are, which I think is important.
Yeah.
And it can shift over a period of time, but at the base level, a lot of your core values were being established before and while you were in the hospital.
Yeah.
Right. So then when you come out and you start looking at what your core values are, a lot of them are the same. Now, how you would define them might change, a little bit over a period of time. But what I've found, a lot of people don't even know what theirs are. So they haven't taken time to look into that. And then they live in this weird world to where they don't know why they can't sleep at night. It's because they violated one of their core values. If it's a line and 0 is neutral, right? You got standard deviations plus or minus.
Yep.
If one of the core values determined is honesty, well, yes, you're going to operate within some of those standard deviations. But once you go 2 standard deviations, further than what you want, you feel a little weird. And that should be like a wake-up call, oh man, maybe I should go back. What are the core values? One of the exercises somebody had me to do years ago was to take the time to look back at influential, and maybe this is where I fall back on those defining moments, to look back at what some of those defining moments were, who was the person and what was said at the time, and then just write it down. And then one page of that, then on the flip side of that page, now write down some defining moments that pissed you off. You'll forgive them, but you're not going to forget it. Wrote that down. Go on Google and search list of core values, and then look at each one of those, and you're going to see what you're for, what you're against, find the correlation, oh shit, here's my core values, write them down. This I did this was actually part of the business exercise I did in developing the business going probably 20 years ago.
Really?
It was to develop the core values for the company.
Smart.
And that way, the way it was explained to me, whenever you have a really, really hard decision to make, which is a lot of times, and you don't know, if you just look, right? Yeah. Integrity is if you're going to do the right thing that movement or at that moment, but and it was one of the best things to be able to do that for me. Now, for others, I don't think they have a fucking clue. Then when they try to come to that base, they don't have it. And until they have that base, it's hard to do these other things that you're talking about. Yeah,
well, and I think this is another area. And when I'm critical of certain leadership books or whatever, that's not me saying I have the answer, right?
I get it.
But this is another thing that I think has been brought on by that. They don't have the answer because a lot of what they've been taught is superficial, and they've had media training, so they can list, if they can list off core values, they haven't gone through actual 5 whys. If even I look back at myself and I'm like, oh, okay, I want to be one of the best strength coaches. Well, why? Well, I want to make an impact in other people's lives. Well, why is that important to you? Yeah. So I can feel at the end of the day, I'm providing value to people. Well, why does that matter to you? Well, because I nearly died and I don't want to feel like my life was wasted or I'm just dicking around. Well, but why does that matter? Because I don't want to lay my head on my pillow at night and wonder if I'm worth a shit, And so like, you just have to, absolutely, you're right. You have to look in and rip yourself apart. Kind of in a way. You have to, and this is what I meant by what I did at that layover in that airport.
Yeah.
I would say, well, what does success look like to me? Pop, 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 pop. Well, why is that successful? Pop, 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 pop. Yeah, go deeper. I would interview myself. Just like, I'm not going to let you get by with an answer, just 5, 6, 7 layers deeper. And I think if you go, well, and research would support this, by and large, people have common drives. Now, this changes the vernacular. Drives and values can be a little different, as you know, but and I want to give credence to where it's due. There's a gentleman named Antonio Damasio, who's a professor of cognitive neuroscience at USC, and he talks about the intersection of logic and emotion. And again, without kind of getting into this, humans by and large are driven by very common things. Now, a couple other professors would say learn, acquire, bond, and defend, and those can be extrapolated, right? Learn about your place in the universe, learn more about yourself, learn more knowledge in general, acquire, that could be social status, approval, money, land, whatever. And I'm just giving selfish, carnal things, right? But, what we've tried to build out, and this came from, a good portion of my work comes from doing therapy and inward thinking on myself, is, all right, well, there's more than that. You think of certain people, they have an achievement drive. They do. They like, that could be, I want to read 10 pages a day. I want to do this. I want to put 5 more kilos on something. But you just achievement. Thank you. You did, like, what drives you? And this is a rabbit hole. And for anybody,
it's a good one. We're going to go down.
Okay, cool. But like, we put a quiz online, but what we had to do with this quiz, to your point, we had to trick people. We had to trick people because when people take a lot of personality tests, Myers-Briggs and DISC, the areas those are a lot of forced choice questions, and also people engage what's called self-monitoring. They tend to answer in the aspirational. They don't actually answer, and then they're not, a lot of the Myers-Briggs and DISC and all that are also forced choice. Like one example of a question is, would you rather be powerful or popular? Like, what's the context of that, right?
Yeah.
So what we had to do when we created this quiz, based off the work of so many other researchers, is we had to create it so that if people answered in an aspirational way or they engaged in too much self-monitoring, even when they thought they were choosing the good answer, it scored against them. So we had to create this algorithm that was essentially like, hey, we're going to look at not just what you answered here and there, the long-term trend, was it consistent? Because the answer to each question coincided with certain drives. Now, of course, nobody's just one drive. You're discerning enough to know that even though you got achievement, you also probably adversity and this and that. But that's the thing is, when people don't ask themselves tough questions, they're not going to get great answers and they're not going to be self-aware. And that's also like when people crave control and validation, their world becomes small. So it's really hard to become self-aware, know thyself, and thus take even the first step at being more effective with other people if you don't do these kinds of things, or if you just allow yourself to chant off this rhetoric, well, I just want to make a difference. It's important to me to do. No. Don't allow yourself to get by with those answers.
And I think there's multiple facets that play into that, where a big rabbit hole here now. You should always have somebody in your circle that's willing to call you out on your own bullshit. You should always have people around willing to ask those deep level whys. Read, expose yourself to as much material as you possibly can with the drives. The first I was exposed to that, I would have probably been 2 decades ago with Tony Robbins. And I think the way that he defined it, because Daniel Pink's got it one, everybody's got their own little way. He had certainty, uncertainty, significance, communication, growth, and contribution, which is basically, when you get to the weeds of the whole thing, achievement, unity, service, adversity, significance. Where for me, it was always easier to remember Tony's thing, because you had certainty, uncertainty, let's say kind of the same thing, just the opposites, then significant, connection. But with all that, when I came back from that and just focused on that, because there's a lot of other mumbo jumbo that goes along with those seminars. That
they're selling hope.
Yeah, a whole bunch of shit, right? Where this was one of the big things that I took away, because I'm thinking to myself, okay, where are my motivations at? What drives me? And of course, it changes. It can change over a day if you're tired, not tired. If my HRT levels are high or low, it all plays into that. But hormones are a big part of that. So, but where is it generally? But on the flip side of that, Where is it for my staff?
Yeah.
Where is it when I'm interviewing people? 'Cause let's say if it's customer service, I want somebody that might be more driven from uncertainty than somebody driven from certainty.
Yep.
Right? And how do you figure out what that is? And these things, and this is where I get frustrated sometimes when people will get into the communication weeds like we were talking about earlier. Like, this shit matters. This shit matters a lot. It's just in the training realm. I can sit there and say, people argue against conjugate and say more linear type stuff, right? I'll come back and say, give me an athlete that's extremely driven by uncertainty, and then put them on a linear program that's going to show them they're going to do the same shit over and over and over and over. And I'm going to show you somebody that doesn't like their training at all.
Yep.
On the flip, show me somebody that's really, they need to know, like, what am I doing, coach? And then it's like, well, fuck, you're going to come in and might do some max effort exercise. I can't tell you what it's going to be.
Yeah.
They're out, they're screwed, and to not understand or take the time to at least, and you can go, I think what might happen is you start getting into some of these worlds and it can go deep really fast, really fast, especially with archetypes and the different influencing factors. And you're like, there's too much. There's just too much. And then they just back off instead of just absorbing a skim level.
Or mental models of it, which we're working, keep going.
Yeah, but it's because I can't go super deep. I can't list you all the archetypes, but I can flip through and know exactly where they are and go look and kind of pin this person's more this level. Just a skim surface. You've gone deep in this other surface, but now you're bringing the content out in a way that's easier for coaches to be able to actually understand.
Yeah, well, to your point, one, the goal is not to have everybody memorize the archetypes.
Yeah.
The goal is to have these mental models and this was something that I faced backlash on too from a small contingent, which is odd. Somebody wanted to argue that they said using archetypes was racist and classist and all these things. And I'm like, time out. Archetypes have been in existence for as long as humans have told stories. The hero, the villain, the this, the that. Archetypes are not static labels, right? Archetypes are a mental model of a representation of somebody's drives in the moment, or it can be consistently over time, depending on the context. It's just saying that people, we all know somebody that posts political stuff online. We all know somebody that's a big foodie. We all know archetypes are a reality. They're attached to one's self-image. So everybody watching, listening, and all that promotes, whether they think they do or not, a self-image to the world. Even the person that says, well, I don't care what anybody thinks of me. Well, as Amos Tversky said, the absence of a feature is still a feature. So that person, you're absolutely engaging in impression management and caring what people think about you. That as human beings, we want to have that understanding. And this is why, another resource for anybody listening is Irving Goffman. He likened communication and the communicative act to theater, as did Shakespeare. We all are actors and actresses with our entrances and our exits. We want people to have impressions of us so that we can meet social needs and goals, right? And so archetypes are just to be used as mental models to help people understand other people aren't like you. Yeah. The golden rule is bullshit, right? Treat other people how you want to be treated. No, because they're not like you. And then what we've done is why they don't have to worry about that so much is we over time have been like, all right, well, how can we simplify it? Not to dumb it down, but to simplify it. Well, for some people, the drives was an easier way to understand archetypes. Because there are certain archetypes that are more unity driven. My wife is very much unity. She wants to be around other people all the time, where my job is being social. So I can get really overwhelmed. Like when you and I are talking, I'm a very intense person about this subject because I saw firsthand poor communication can cost people your life and results. So it means a lot. I'm not intense for the sake of being intense. But that takes a lot out of me. My wife, on the other hand, she works mainly from home. So she wants to be around a ton of other people. Yeah. So if you actually look, when I was going through the book, and I'm like, it's interesting. These archetypes can actually fit into different drive categories. So when people come to our workshops, we don't go through every archetype. We say, hey, listen, as far as coaching or leadership goes, so goes communication, so goes perception, so goes understanding of the self, so goes understanding of strategies and tactics you have to use in these kinds of situations, right? So we'll talk about drives, we'll talk about how those can manifest in certain ways, and as you alluded to, the core values of Elite FTS, right, featured into this. Marketing is a form of communication, and ethical communication at that, right? So we look at this in terms of our staff. Part of our hiring process is having people go through those drives quiz, and then also other contextual elements as well to parse out. When we looked at athletes, to your point, you mentioned this in terms of the programming. I started asking athletes, I said, hey, what part of this session resonated with you? Certain athletes that were really, they loved learning, they loved kind of achieving. They were like, oh, I love the details and the nuance and this and that. There were certain athletes that I just like the competitive shit. Okay, well, great. That's by and large an adversity drive. Yeah. They loved the, another one was like, the individual stuff doesn't do it for so much for me. The team relay or this and working as a part of a big group, unity drive. And so I'd ask them these questions over time, and they were very simple questions, but we'd get consistent data points with them over time. And I'd start to say, okay, if I want to elicit a certain reaction or energy or output today, how can I pair people up in groups that are certain drives? How can I put them in racks? How can I do this? And the coach that says they don't have time for this, again, I am going to be stubborn. Your job is coaching. Yeah. Coaching is a social process done with social individuals in a social environment. Do not tell me that you can sit here and look and understand bands and chains and this and that, but then when it comes to people, it's too much. Yeah. You know what I mean? I'm sorry, like to a point, like somebody just needs to ask themselves, am I actually in this because I like the people side and the training side, and it can be both. But if there's a massive asymmetry between how much you're addressing the human being side and how much you're addressing the other, that's an issue. And then the last part is, yes, your customers. So even in our segmentation of our marketing emails, right? We know the messages that we're tailoring. Yep. We're not going to have constant like, oh, understand this or you'll be left behind. Or is there a time for things like that? Yes, unfortunately, because people have carnal hedonistic fears, and they have to, by the way, be forced into action a lot of times. People can be lazy, but there's other things that are going to speak to other drives. So we use this to manage our marketing, our hiring, and also just even this conversation, being able to balance these things.
Why would you not? Because the science is there. Right. And it's on the other side of this isn't just about the leaders, right? Those people who are not in leadership roles should still have understanding of all this, right? Because they need to know what tactic is being used. Yes. When they're being marketed to. Yeah. Right. To me, in fact, I'm trying to figure it out. Yep. Just because I'm in business. Right. Like, what tactic is this? Oh, this is kind of an interesting way of doing this. This is unethical as fuck. Yeah. And you can kind of parch it all out, where today, if the athlete understands where their drive comes from and what that is at that why level, it getting down into what we're talking about here. And now we're moving into this world of more and more online coaching, which is removing a lot of the communication aspect. To me, it's now the athlete is even more responsible for being able to better communicate to their coach what they need. Yeah, well, and this goes back to what I had said earlier and built off an earlier comment that you made about leadership not being about the one here. It's about the stakeholders, right? It's this interactive thing. So to your point, that feeds into another inciting incident for me that got me into this stuff. I was just exposed to a lot of shady people. I met a lot of shady people in my life. And I eventually, like you just said, I kind of wanted to know, how do I not get taken advantage of? How do I not deal with what I dealt with last time? How do I see these punches coming? And I liken it to a boxing analogy. I want to learn to block and counter. And so, I'm very much aware there's people that have done amazing work out there. I reference them in all my stuff. Robert Cialdini, Gary Uckel from the University of Albany. But the problem is a lot of these researchers, like most, never talked much to each other. And that's why you see, like to your point earlier, this model that can be hard for people to understand, because, okay, Cialdini talks about persuasion, Uckel talks about influence, somebody else talks about drives and whatever. For us, a big part of what's now my doctorate is putting these together in a way that's a little bit more easy to understand. And it's still going to be heavy lifting. Yeah. I'm sorry I'm sorry none of us got taught this in school. I'm sorry none of us I didn't grow up with a lot of this. And so my next book, even talking to my publisher, they were like, this is going to be a lot. And I said, well, yeah, but listen, this is targeted towards people that are tired of leadership bullshit, want to look inward and want to kind of do the heavy lifting because they've been taken advantage of, or they've followed the Lombardi books and all those other books and they've realized it's valuable, but this isn't helping me when I need it most, when I'm screwed over. So that's kind of what our work focuses on, is like, if you want to reduce the risk of you being screwed over, or, and you don't obviously, you don't want to be your own worst enemy too, we're trying to teach you the equivalent of think of communication like gravity. Yes, you can't see it, and it's like you can't handle it in all the same ways that you can, much of this great equipment and everything else, but it absolutely impacts everything around you.
And don't complain about why people won't change or why you have this unfortunate circumstance or why this person leaped ahead of you and knew how to play the game if you don't want to do the heavy lifting. And it's a reprieve to hear you say these things, not because of confirmation bias, but because you would think that life just teaches these people this enough. And then you've got to, but I think that's a problem again, Dave, is like most people, it's easier to point the finger and have an external locus of control to say, well, it's circumstances, it's not me. No, take some onus. It can't just be about being motivated. It can't just be about this. You have to see these invisible forces to block and counter these punches. Does that make sense?
No, it's 100% where it's coming from the path that we come from, same path, different realms, but still just weight room shit, right?
Yeah.
Coming from weight room stuff, yes, we're not taught this stuff in school, but were we taught periodization? Were we taught the different methods of periodization? Were you actually in a fucking weight room, in school, in college at some point in time with the kinesiology and I have an exercise science degree. I didn't spend one goddamn day in the weight room. Right. So now if my whole university experience was designed around trying to be a strength coach, which is what it was, then I can't graduate. I don't buy that argument that, because it wasn't taught in school, it's not important, which a lot of people will fall back on is their excuse, I guess.
Or they just want to say it's too much to learn. And it's like,
they
gotta catch up.
They learned the other shit.
Yeah.
Actually, they overlearned the other. I would say from that world, the college strength and conditioning world, they have overlearned the physical attributes because they're essentially working with beginners. Yeah,
you're not using half of the techniques that you like.
Yes.
It becomes and pardon the language, it's like this intellectual masturbation, you know. And to a point, it's like you start looking at a lot of this research, and I just remember, where can I apply this, in my life elsewhere? I'm like, it's becoming so granular. And all these controlled settings or with but I worked with a lot of pro athletes, and you've worked with a ridiculous amount of high level people. There were some of them that still just didn't understand how to clean or move or warm up yet. Now we're talking about college freshmen using accentuated eccentrics with weight releasers when the kid can barely blink and breathe and march and skip at the same time. But again, we have some people that hear that and they go on attack mode. I mean, think about it, right? You're going to have a thumbnail for this episode. You're going to have all these things. By and large, though, what are people going to see when they're scrolling through that's more sexy? Topics on like, oh, this person teaches this and this, or here's this person talking about communication. So that's the task at hand now, is to actually reframe and remarket communication. Make people realize that it's not the stuff that, and again, all due respect to him, like Tony Robbins and people like that I've talked about. It is one of the most complex, nuanced, and yes, sexy sciences you can learn because it's inveterate to power dynamics. It's inveterate to every aspect of your life. And it's like, all right, so that's our task now. So we realize that we almost can't talk to it as communication. We have to talk to it as you do with anything, like painting the dream. Like if you want to get more work done, if you want to have better relationships and you want to waste less time, right? Like you need to learn, and what we brand is social agility, the ability to be able to adapt and analyze and see, different contexts in real time and be able to kind of manage these things. So even coming up with a different term and concept to invite people in, and then they realize, holy shit, this is so much more than I thought. But it's a full-time job to get people to do. When one guy came to our workshop, I go, why did you come? And he had been in pro sport a long time. And he goes, you know what, man, at some point I was just ready to work on the hard stuff. The training is still very interesting to me. I love it. I'll do it my whole life. But like this was the stuff that was impacting me day to day. I'm like, how do you bottle that up and market it when some people just aren't ready to hear that message? The old Bruce Lee adage, correct me if I'm wrong, right? The teacher appears when the student is ready. We also realize that our target demographic are people that like by and large get it. They're kind of swallowed that hard pill and they're like, yeah, man, I'm ready because I know this expands to every part of my life, business, but yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear your take. How do you reconceptualize communication in some people's minds so that they realize, like, they don't just think like, oh, that's not interesting, or that's this, that's that.
If it's a strength athlete that I'm working with or mentoring, then I break it down to the most basic level is recovery. Right. So the goal of training is to recover from each session. Right. So, and then there's things in your life you can control and things in your life you can't control. Those things in your life that you can control, you need to work on trying to control. So if you're in the gym busting your ass, take an antibiotic, whatever you're doing, there's a risk factor there. So you're willing to take all these risks to be able to get better on the platform. Then you go home and then it's a highly stressed environment, or your friends are pissing you off, or what you read online is driving you insane. So all these things you're able to control if you understand how to communicate and how you're being communicated to. And then if you can take that just from like a 6 out of 10 and to a 2, then there's less cortisol, there's less stress. When you're recovering, you're actually recovering.
Great point.
Then when you come back in to hit the next session, you're able to hit it better. There's so many factors that happen outside the gym that impact what happens in the gym that the higher level strength athletes begin to figure out, because they become the difference makers.
Yep.
The younger ones, that's a tough nut to crack because they can recover from about anything, drinking all night long and all this other shit, come and break PR. That's different, but at least if that conversation's there, like your life doesn't have to be complete chaos unless that's what drives you.
Right.
Now, if that's what drives you, then that's fine. But a lot of that just basically comes down to it's communication.
Yeah, well, and I think the excellent point you make there too, because we have to measure and manage certain aspects of recovery and training. I ask people, I go, just stop for a minute. Think about 24 hours ago or the last 7 days, right? And we'll even audit our finances, right? We'll go back and we'll look at our budget. I go, think of the things that have caused you the most stress. How many of them came back to interpersonal relationships? Yeah. How many of them came back to that? And so like, we just think it's ridiculous that we will manage our exercise, our diet, nutrition, all these things, our sleep. We have all these things that will manage all these pieces now, but people don't audit their interactions and communication. Usually I wear it. It was out of battery today, but I'll wear something that Amazon developed. It's called the Halo Band, and it's imperfect, but it's interesting for the work we're doing. And it's got a feature called tone. So right now it would give me real-time analysis of how I might be perceived with my tone. Warm, inviting, enthusiastic, skeptical.
You mean tonality?
Yeah, tonality.
Yeah.
And so, and MIT has something called a sociometric badge that if we were wearing right now would even alert us and measure our turn taking, our listening. Now, the problem is things like that aren't available to the public. There's another piece of software that your audience can go research. We talk about this at our workshop. It's called Cogito, Cogito. And they use it for customer service folks, where burnout is very, very high because, let's say you and I are working in customer service. We might solve everybody's problem that day, but we're still getting yelled at. They just don't like us, right? Mm-hmm. So they had to find a way to meet that achievement drive and help these customer service reps feel like, hey, you're still making a difference. So what they use is what's called conversational analysis software that will literally tell them, hey, Brett, you've talked too long. Pass it to Dave. Make sure that you ask Dave a question. Use a little bit more humor, all these things. Again, not available to the public. We've reached out to them and we've said, hey, we have this 26-point evaluation that we're using. It's research-backed, tied to my doctorate. You have to put that in there so they know you're not wasting their time, right? It's not bragging. And we'd love to use your software because when we use real-time role-playing, this conversational sparring, social scrimmaging, we'd like people to get that feedback. You know what they tell me? We only sell this to organizations that have 10,000 customer service reps or more. And so it's interesting. There's consumer products for all this stuff that can help people visualize the things that they're already wanting to learn about. My point is I think to also get better, and I think this builds off what you're saying, but again, feel free to correct me. We also need things that help make communication more visual and present in our daily lives. So at the end of me presenting in Australia, I was able to look at my tone via I can get the readout on my phone and it'll say, you had 4 minutes today where you seemed aggressive, angry, or upset. You had 5 moments where you were more charismatic. And again, it doesn't matter that these things may not be purely objective because there's nothing in life purely objective, right? There's subjectivity in everything. And the main thing is that perception matters. Now, and so that's kind of what we're trying to solve for. We don't have a tech genius like that on our team, but what we do have is at this point thousands of these evaluations, and we can get there if you want, that break down communication into all these different categories that we can actually be more aware of. Use of questioning, listening, use of influence, tone, like, hey, Dave, tempo. The average I speak right now at about 185 words per minute. Okay. The research shows that it becomes problematic if people start speaking at about 300 words per minute. But is that the same for somebody in Puerto Rico? speaking slang to their friend? Is that the same as somebody from South Boston? So tone, tempo, aesthetics, biometrics, kinesics. We've been taught that nonverbal is kind of this all-encapsulating thing. No, nonverbal is like, go ahead and shrug your shoulders. That's kinesics, right? On the other hand, if you come over and you give me a fist bump, that's haptics. So what we're trying to do is not confuse people, but we're trying to, like, on one end, make some of our products just easy to understand, inviting. The other ones, because we now do have some nerds that are like, no, I want to measure this now. But I think that once society gets to a point where you realize, hey, social relationships, and there's research on this, play just as big of a role, if not larger, in all-cause mortality as sleep and everything else, we'll start realizing that. And companies are already investing billions of dollars in that tech, just not all available to the public right now.
I think as we get more into this AI thing, the more this is going to have to come into play, because being authentic, some people think it's easy, right? I mean, it's, and I get why they would, right? Because it's just authentic, but it's not, right? And at some point in time, we're going to have to compete against, AI generated, we're already with text, words, and all this other kind of stuff, which will be able to do a better job in time than what a human could, as far as writing a program, right?
Yeah.
Just writing a training program, for instance. But the application being able to be authentic in how you're going to deliver that's going to matter as well. And then being able to understand what that authenticity means, and what part of what part of each of us rings more with somebody than the other parts, because it's usually not the part we think it is. No.
And you bring up and I think you've done this exceedingly well over the years, but my colleague, Ali Kirshner, and I talk about this, even looking at authenticity, right? People have this idea, and this speaks to you saying people think it's easier than it is. People have this idea that authenticity is one thing. You have a range of authentic selves. Yeah. Right? We have a range. Like me, the way I'm authentic with my wife on date night is very different than the way I'm authentic when I'm teaching to a multicultural audience, which is different than the conversation I'm going to have with you, where there's certain things, like you and I have to make instantaneous decisions on where we want to go. We're improvising. Life and leadership and coaching is improvising. There are certain things we might want to go into a rabbit hole, but we know we need to provide and siphon that value down to the listener. And so then we're being authentic, but we're being authentic with a goal here, right? And then we'll have a goal after the cameras turn off, but you've got to manage that. And that's customer service by and large, right? Which, you have different products for people that like the way you present your products and stuff is going to have a different voice. So people need to, again, it goes into everything we're saying is getting out of this one size fits all thinking, black, white. It's a range, it's a spectrum. And it's a lot of work, but what's going to give you a better return on investment in your life than doubling down on the work of social interaction, relationships, and self-awareness, and not in a hokey way, in a way that's like, let's go, let's get real. Because by and large, you might also see, and I can pull up the literature on this if we want to get into the weeds, but look what happened during COVID. When our ability to communicate was impacted, you started to see what the New York Times referred to as social atrophy. You saw mental illness and all these things skyrocket. The worst thing you can do to a human being is not the electric chair and lethal injection. I'm not downplaying those, but it's social isolation. You literally see a part of the brain shrink when we're isolated. So I agree with you. I think as we continue to see this emergence of technology and the visualization of communication and what is effective or agile communication is going to get encoded in people's minds a lot differently, you're going to see an uptick. And we know as a business, we're going to have competition. Yeah. We invite that. It makes the space bigger. I mean, do you care, beyond a point that you have competition in the space that you're in, or do you invite that because it's your differentiation? I don't even know how to define it. So if I'm looking at what we do, we provide education, complementary education, and we use the products that we retail as a way to provide the complementary information. So who else does that? But people will back up and then they'll be able to say, well, X, Y, and Z, they all sell equipment. I'm like, but we sell equipment, but we provide this education. Now, the caveat, the fact that they thought that means that there's a disconnect in the message I'm putting out. So I can't sit there as most would and say, well, that's bullshit. This is what we do. I have to say, what are we doing incorrectly to be able to communicate the message that what we do is
received as what we do instead of, oh, you're an equipment supplier, or you're a band supplier, or you're this, or shit, I didn't know you even had this. Then boom, that's not them.
No.
Like, that's me. And after 25 years, that market, it's a dynamic market. It shifts, it changes all the time. So there's a point in time where, how often does the message have to be repeated? How often do you have to circle back? When does it have to come back? All these things is influence, right? Which, oh God, we can't talk about that, which comes to communication, which comes to the marketing, and then all these other attributes that kind of go along with that, which I wish more people would focus on, but I'm kind of glad that a lot don't,
right?
Because I'm not in this big corporate space. I'm in this small business space to where I can be more competitive based upon these type of things. I don't know what the more macro corporate level would look like to compete in, because I've never been there. I'm sure it changes to where, I've often said before, at a macro level, you're dealing with corporate politics. At a family business level, you're dealing with, small business drama. It's different as far as the way the game's played.
Well, and you're right. To try for somebody to reduce what you guys do to equipment and all this would be like saying Disney's theme parks, right? What Disney has talked about. Sorry, I didn't write.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
I remember, Disney saying like what their core product is happiness, and there's a wide ecosystem of things that they believe bring people happiness. The theme parks, the content they create, so on and so forth. And so you're right. It is influence and power. And just to define those things real quickly, because you're right. People, we can't talk about this. Power is the capacity for one to create change in another person's psychological environment or behavior. Capacity being keyword. Okay. Power, it's almost like potential energy. If we're looking in kinesiology terms, right? Influence is one's ability to leverage power to do that. So we know certain people can have resource power. They could have a lot of money, but they don't actually influence or change anything because they don't use that for anything, right? Power is just a resource, right? And we can go through types of power later if you'd like. Influence is how well we use that. So when people get all up in arms about these dark terms, manipulation and power, well, you manipulate, the knob on the fan, you manipulate the knob in your volume, in the radio in your car. Power and influence are just about your capacity and your ability to create changes in behaviors, attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs. And those things are required to get humans to do things. Why? Because humans are stubborn, right? We all know we should get more sleep and brush our teeth and all that. We don't do it. What is more information going to solve that? No, that like logic alone doesn't change people's minds. So you have to use different types of influence, which is why you have to become politically savvy in those things, right? Like to a degree, the ends justify the means when you have a stubborn animal like the human being. Now, when people want to bring up examples of unethical people, okay, well, I'm not speaking to that. A hammer has been used to kill people and also create structures. Like it's a tool. And the other thing is, and I'd love to know where you're at with this, it does get exhausting in today's day and age. Because you're right, we do have a responsibility to repeat it and make our message clear. But man, it never ends, right? Especially as they change algorithm. There was a time where you could post one thing, and I'm pretty boring on social media just because this content isn't going to share well over there, and we don't have a bunch of videographers that work for us. Where you could get a ton of people see it. Now maybe 20% of my audience sees that. So we do the podcast, we do a newsletter, we do all these other things that is a different kind of medium, has different levels of access, but we find that you just constantly have to hit people from all angles to make sure they know what you do. That can get exhausting.
Oh, it is. It is.
How do you manage that on your end, even though you have a team? Like, how do you manage just the mental bandwidth of saying, we've said this a million times and we got to say it again? And I'm simplifying there.
If our target are people that place training as one of their top 4 priorities, and that's how I've always defined that, that's high, because you got family, faith, you work, that's up there, that's high, but that also means it can be people that it's their first, right? So it's a different thing. That there becomes a little nuance too, because you might get somebody that's 16, 17, or 18 that thinks it's their number 1 priority, but it's really not until they're really pressed, on that. And so what ends up happening is the actual demographic that is the customer is a little bit older than, say, TikTok or what Instagram used to be. So each one of these social networks change a little bit over time as far as what that demographic ends up becoming, where we've made mistakes in the past. I've made mistakes in the past is not putting enough leverage, say, in YouTube. It's like, oh, okay, this is just a great way to embed videos in articles so I didn't have to pay for the hosting of that video, and not really seeing that those people get older. So that's where it becomes exhausting, right? Because you know the message for the actual customer demographic range that you're looking for, right here. Here's the income, here's the age, here's gender, here's this, right? But then you got to also be in the space of the people who are going to move there.
Yep.
That part there is exhausting. But what I've found is it's how much you don't need to put 80% effort in this space, because it will come at a loss of that main space. So whatever that main space is needs to stay the main space, but you cannot disregard that other space. And then it's staying on point with the message and making the people that come in understand what the message is. That becomes tough too. It's all tough. Nothing's easy. I just assume it's hard. It's just.
Oh, and this is the beauty of it, right? Because it ties into, and you mentioned this earlier too, this is again the intersection of we're talking right now about marketing. This is coaching. You have to repeat the message to the people you lead, the people you teach. Just having the mission and vision statement isn't enough. You've got to codify that and repeat that. Mirror exposure effect constantly. People have to see it again. And mirror exposure effect just being you have to have this repetition of messages. Sometimes it's 4 to 8 times before somebody really is like, okay, I've got that imprint now. And so this is leading your staff. This is coaching your athletes, or whatever the terminology anybody listening does. This is your business. This is your marriage. My wife and I are dealing with this right now as we run a business together. Our fundamental relationship is different than it was just being parents and being autonomous individuals before. And so we've got to re-clarify these things, especially because we have a remote staff. So for us too, trying to get, I think one thing that has been exhausting is, all right, I know the message, and in the past I've been the one sharing it, but now I've got to get the staff sharing it a lot, and then I've got to be mindful of what they share, because some people are just going to be stubborn and say, no, I'm only going to follow your stuff on Instagram. I'm not going to die, even though our deeper stuff is going to be the newsletter and the podcast. And I'm glad you said what you said. Like you do have to kind of be everywhere, although you still have to follow that Pareto's principle. There was a time where we were going to try to double and triple down on YouTube, but then between the batching content and all this, I'm like, I actually got a job to do. We just didn't have those resources, and we run it out of our home. And so we're like, all right, we do need to be on the world's second largest search engine. We do need to have some stuff on YouTube. However, it can't be this, somebody can't expect, and this is kind of like, the audience has to know this. You can't be somebody that expects to get the same information, whether it's you or me, on YouTube as you'd get at a workshop, if you expect everything to give you all the answers, it can't. A business owner has to create an ecosystem of opportunity for engagement. Same thing for a coach. You have to think, what are the myriad ways that I can tailor my message, target my message, invite the other people that are involved in this leadership process in, and then make it accessible for them to kind of improve it or give us feedback on it. But it's tricky. It's something as a business owner I did not, and I mean, a lot of challenges, but you're like, whoo, that can wear on you.
It's still, I can say it's still the same, is the strength and conditioning. So if I'm looking at what we're talking about, all these different networks that you have to be on, then I'm looking at when I was still competing. I have these max effort exercises. Some of them have correspondence to my main lift, some don't. The accessories, all these different things, how they're being quantified, how am I tracking them, what is the ROI? Right? What is that? So just going on YouTube or just going on Instagram, just going on TikTok or whatever it is, isn't enough. I need to know what are the indicators and throughout my whole time in business, I've always started with way too many indicators. What are the trackable indicators that I can try to find correspondence with? Then you track that on a monthly basis. And obviously this is all going to track back to what is the main indicator that you are using to gauge the success of the business. It's, I'm a numbers person, I'm achievement driven. Of course I want it to be gross sales. I really do, because that's the bigger number. But that doesn't mean shit if, you know what I'm saying? If the net revenue is negative, I'm out of business.
Right.
Net revenue. So I've always operated on valuation, which I can't have done all the time. Maybe every couple of years or whatever it's going to be. But I have the main indicators that are we moving toward the goal or away? And then I can look into the sub metrics of what each social network is. Is this making an impact? Is it having, it's actually easier than strength and conditioning, because it's really hard to know if a front squat is going to carry over to the field, right? You're just guessing. Where with the right metrics, you can see this actually led to an ROI here. Is it positive? Like, did we spend more money to produce this content than it actually returned, and thus? And then when you start with too many, over a period of time, you can begin to narrow it down, because I do look at the P&L every single day, but I'm only looking at 3 different things on there every single day. Now if something's off, I know where to go look and go deeper. Same thing with the other metrics. If I'm looking at on a weekly basis, here's the metrics for whatever social media network that we're on. This is way off. Why? Right. And then I'll go to, Owen or Sheena, or I'll go to whoever's kind of in that field to say, what's going on with these metrics? What do we think? We'll talk about it a little bit to be able to see. Sometimes the whole network just goes away. Like, this is not doing shit. Then when you look at the expense, like, well, how much does it cost to put because content, by the way, guys, does not just appear for free.
Right. People think it does.
No, I know they do.
It's amazing. They think that we just I have to remind people of this, like, hey, thank our sponsors, do this, because this podcast, right, they enable these things to happen. But you touch on something interesting here, right? If we have this circle, this pie chart, because we've talked about how coaches need to learn more about communication. You look at these as 3 parts, and you mentioned the business side here too. We understand, or have an understanding of aspects of the science of training. Like, we have people that, we have a lot of content there. We have no shortage of education around that. Now, there's still, room to grow, of course, with anything. But then we have this science of communication side of things that has largely been just ignored, and then an understanding of business. And there's a lot of coaches out there that don't like to think of what they do as a business.
It is.
You're in a business.
You are.
You're in a bit. And so this, when you were saying, when people were like, oh, you're a sellout or whatever, I'm like, because I want to understand nobody says that, again, to Jay-Z or Dr. Dre. Like, these were rappers, music. But that again shows just the industry maturity. I remember one time, and God bless him, I read his book and loved it back in the day. Vern Gambetta was like, we need to quit calling this an industry. Jesus, can we get over the nomenclature of this? There's a business.
At some point in time, somebody sat behind a desk, right? So here's head coach, you're sitting behind the desk, here's your resume, which is probably 50% bullshit. Right. And then you're selling yourself to me, right? Everything is sales. No matter what anybody wants to think, it's all sales. And all the people that will push back and say, because I went through a little bit of this early on, just because the powerlifter sellout type of stuff. Everybody it's all sales. Like, you went for a job interview at some point and you're trying to position yourself better than the person who may also be interviewing. And I'm pretty sure if I had access to your resume at that time, I could find some bullshit in there too. Padded. Not bullshit, not lying, but just very nicely padded.
Impression management.
Yes, because you had somebody help you make it look better, which is sales, right? And so that kind of stuff, it's just defeatist attitude, that comes from somebody not willing to put in. The reality of life is you have to learn more than your discipline. Fact, right? So unfortunately, that's true. Like, there's a lot of things I would just love to only do, but I still have to do all this other stuff.
Steve Jobs, none of these other people could just isolate. Why can, that's the thing is, like, when people say these things, there were some people that criticized me early on and then later would be like, hey, I got fired and screwed over. Now I want to listen. And it's just like, you want to be like, the price doubled, buddy. You know what I mean? I'm joking.
No, I get it.
Yeah, it is. And just touching on the gross versus net real quick, because I love this. Like, you look at it, if we were to use the analogy of timing 40s, gross is like the hand time thing you tell your grandma, net is the laser time, the actuality of it. Yeah, like whether you are trying to get a job, keep a job, advance within a job, any of these things, run a business, or tell your athletes or individuals why a certain exercise will help them or why a certain intervention will help them, that is sales. And that, Dan Pink did a great book on that too, just to sell as human. You sell yourself every day that you can be a great father or mother or whatever. And so that's where I just went into like, all right, well, what is this aversion? And the aversion is just many coaches they're uncomfortable with it. Fear of the unknown, fear that they're going to have to like suppression. They feel like somebody's going to take their market share, or they're not good at this, or fear of exposure, fear of all these things. And I mean, there was a time where just because I was on social media and Twitter, I was getting just ridiculed. It was like, well, how are you doing this if you're coaching all the time? I'm like, you can schedule tweets. You know what I mean? You can schedule tweets. And then I just thought it was interesting because you'd be in this room of people that are supposed lifelong learners and servant leaders. Yeah, they wouldn't share with anybody, and then they'd criticize everybody else. My favorite was one person that put a little fake profile picture on Twitter, and they're like, well, they criticized everybody. And somebody says, well, who are you? And he goes, well, that doesn't matter because everything I do is for the athletes and other individuals. So there is interesting research that talks about this with impression management. And this will make sense to a lot of coaches if they really think about it. What coaches that use that call other people sellouts, call this, or say it's not about me, they are using a morality-based impression management tactic that is all about trying to differentiate themselves by appealing to moral virtue. And it's interesting because you look at history, a lot of these people that espouse the collective and moral virtues, a lot of these people are kind of cult leaders or didn't really do things throughout history. It's an easy grab for control because an argument and a debate will always draw a larger crowd than anything else. And so by vilifying all these other people, these charlatans and this and that, and you're like, no, what this actually is schadenfreude. You feel like somebody else winning is you losing, and you have this issue. And so, yeah, it's like, and you see this a lot in strength and conditioning. Look how much they lean on this almost religious, like, it's not about me, it's everybody else. I'm the dumbest person in the room. I'm just grateful to be here. Servant this, service that. It's like, no. By and large, and you can find the research on this, that kind of use of impression management started in education when substitute teachers who were called into a school district were trying to get a job. And so they'd get in, maybe they were paid for a couple of days. They'd go to the principal and they'd say, and we can put this in the show notes. I'll be happy to send the article. And they'd kind of say, hey, I'm in it for the kids. I'm in it for the right reasons. I'll work hard. I'll do it cheaper. I'll whatever. And so strength and conditioning coaches started to use this as a business, whether they know they do it or not, and they know they do it. They're using this as a form of differentiation. They love to lean on the morality. They love to lean on the virtue. They love to lean on that. But then at the same time, Dave, what do they complain about on the back end? We're not paid the same. We're last hired, first fired. Well, guess what? When you tell a bunch of people that you're not in it for the money, that you'll work all day, first in, last out, don't be mad when they take you at your word. You know what I mean? And so it's funny because they'll use these tactics to kind of appear better than or as more viable options than other strength coaches that they view their competition. But that supposed virtue becomes a vice when they get fired because you're basically negotiating against yourself. So these impression management tactics are really interesting. All these people that decry everybody else's sellouts, they're the ones doing the most marketing. They're the ones leaning into this stuff the most. They just pull the veil over you by it's morally virtuous or it's not about me. It's bullshit. You're scared to get in the arena. You're scared to get criticized. It's really easy to find out. One thing that made content interesting to me, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, you can't hide. No. You can hide for a little bit, but after a certain amount of stuff, you have a certain amount of episodes, you have a certain amount of this. I have to put out a newsletter, a podcast, all this stuff all the time. You've been doing it for well over a decade. You can't hide because to a point, excellence is self-evident and so is bullshit. Eventually, people are going to find it.
Let's take a bathroom break real quick, then I'll come back and we'll go into that. I also want to go into this for the athletes thing because I have some opinions on that, which will be interesting. So we'll take a break real quick.
Cool.
Merrick Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told it's part of getting older? You just go to merrickhealth.com/table talk and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done, and then from there get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. AmericHealth.com/Table Talk. The discount code is Table Talk. Today's episode is brought to you by First Attachment. Are you looking for a supplement brand that truly understands hardworking athletes? Look no further than First Attachment. 1D's real world experience is what I would consider, and they consider, battle tested. I have known Justin Harris for pretty close to 2 decades. And if there's anybody that I trust with nutritional and supplement needs, it's Justin Harris. If you guys have followed me and have followed the podcast, you pretty much already know how I feel about the supplement industry. For me to get behind any brand, I have to trust the brand and I have to trust the person both. And I'm pretty sure you guys all know why. When it comes to creating formulas and putting products on the market, and there's nobody that I trust more than Justin Harris. While I love all of their products, I'd suggest that you check out the Field Rations and WTH first. Go to www.firstdetachment.com and use the code TableTalk10 to save 10% off each order. The link is in the description. Today's episode is brought to you by Element, a tasty electrolyte drink mix with everything that you need and nothing that you don't. In other words, no sugar, no artificial coloring, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, and no BS. With Element, I love the watermelon. The watermelon tastes freaking awesome. I drank 1 pack every day, no matter what. People that train out here, it's sitting out here for them all the time. The boxes don't last very long. Right now, Element is offering Table Talk listeners a free sample pack with any purchase. That's 8 single serving packages free with any Element order. Get yours at drinkelement.com/Table Talk. The deal is only available through the link in the description. The other thing is, if you don't like it, you can just give it away to a salty friend and Element will give you a 100% refund. No risk, money back guarantee. Head over to drinkelement.com/Table Talk. I want to let you guys know that we just had a limited edition drop on the website last week of new items that sweatshirt, flannel, t-shirts, shorts. Basically, the limited edition items are the items that directly support the Table Talk podcast. So if you go to elitefts.com/limited edition, or actually just the link in the description, you can find the limited edition items that we have now, which there's the one that I like the best is the shit, suck, good, great, which is all emojis. The designs I always like the best, right? They're the ones that don't sell for shit, but they're the ones that I want to wear that I like the best. And there's the cigar one as well. And they're all there on the screen for you guys to be able to see. So if you go to elitefts.com/limited edition, the other thing that directly helps support the podcast that I haven't talked that much about is the Table Talk crew. The Table Talk crew is extra edition episodes that go out once a month. The content of those episodes are AMA related, question related, that come from the Table Talk Discord group, which is also part of being in the crew. When you're in the crew, there's dozens of ebooks that are in there. There's every seminar that we've ever done is put on there. There's courses that are put on there. There's series that have put on there. The original YouTube channel that we had for many years before we migrated to the newer one, all that old content is on there. There's discussion groups for just general training, fitness, life, nutrition, basically everything that you can think of is on. So just go look at what that is, or better than that, just go to the description, click on join the crew. That helps directly support the podcast, which is how we're able to keep this thing rolling. All right, where I want to jump back into this was you asked me about I took my glasses off. The coaches can't hide, and the question that you asked me was my thoughts on that. And it's you can't, when you're online producing content, you can't. And it was, when I started, it was pre-Facebook, the reason I started online was because my brother gave me a computer for Christmas, and it was dial-up at the time that he put together, and he was an IT guy. And I logged on, the dial-up thing. Yeah. And then I start searching powerlifting, and, I had a Malamute at the time. So Malamute dogs, and then Westside and stuff like that. And I'm like, this isn't really what we're doing at Westside. So I started answering some questions for somebody else there. But forums were a thing. So then I started to see and log on, I guess, whatever you would call it, to some of these different forums. And I'm like, this is interesting. Like, who are these people?
They were all over the place.
They were everywhere, and there were trolls, and the trolling was way better back then than later. But then we started the Q&A, and then the reason it was just, here's the question, here's the answer, stop, was because I didn't like what I saw in all the forums, because it just became good quality information ends up becoming stifled with a bunch of other crap, that it's just troll crap, where that provided the ability to be able to share those things. But on the back end, for the people that were helping me at the time, I did it by myself for about a year and a half, then started bringing other people in. The comments coming through the back end were fierce.
Really?
Right? Oh yeah. And then the threads that would start in other places were fierce. Like, this motherfucker, there's just criticism all over the place and everywhere. And that dies down. It's way less now than what it was back then, but that's just part of the process. It's just part of the game, and sometimes it's way hotter than it is other times. And a lot of I'm more numb to it now, where actually I wouldn't even say I'm numb to it. I welcome it because it's engagement. So talk all the shit that you want. I freaking love it. And I tell these guys, don't delete anything unless it's really, really bad, right, or like a personal attack that's going to bother somebody. And then just let it all go, because engagement only helps.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that really answers the...
No, it does. And just to touch on that, it's interesting, right? Trolling is a form of marketing. So you'd even see trolls that would be like, this person just, you're like, hey, you're trying to get seen and noticed here, aren't you? Two, what you're speaking to really is, you develop this contextual intelligence where you realize that, like you said, it comes with the territory. If you're going to put things online, then you're going to get chirping, because there's inevitably somebody there that's going to say, this doesn't line up with every experience I've ever had in my life ever.
Yeah.
You also, and this isn't meant to be funny or rude, but the reality is, according to Johns Hopkins, more than 26% of the United States population has an undiagnosed mental illness. So you're also going to see some people that just like chirp because they're unhappy and they're mad and whatever. But regardless, you listen to that. Somebody once asked me, what criticism do you listen to? Well, I internalize a lot of it, because it makes me think, all right, was the point clear enough? Well, what was the medium? There's certain mediums, as we talked about earlier, like don't go onto my Instagram and expect me to give you a Proust level, analysis of everything that I talk about. Don't expect, so I'm like, all right, where was I the problem here? But you start to vet these things out, but you just know it comes with it. But there was one coach that he just said, listen, I was very much anti having a business, having a brand, because I was probably scared to put my thoughts out there. It's like, all right, well then just admit that.
Yeah.
But a brand is just your promise to the world. A brand is not a sales thing. It's a reputation thing. It's saying, hey, this is what I stand for, your values, as you stated earlier, or this is what our business is for. This is the promise we're going to try to keep. By the way, we're not perfect. Yeah. But these people that just, you look at the amount of things strength coaches have demonized: power, influence, a brand, marketing, sales, business. What are you happy about? You know what I mean? And at some point, you're just not happy with yourself or your situation or whatever. It is a business. You do have a brand. You don't have to have a business to have a brand. You as a human being, the people I'll bump into at the airport on the way home, they have a brand in that moment I meet them. Are they rude? Are they nice? Whatever. And so sometimes you just want to say, can we think like adults? And by the way, is this what we'd worry about when we're 99 and you're on your deathbed and whatever?
Yeah.
Like, it's just a lot of nonsense and it's a lot of noise. But once again, in my opinion, it's another reason why we need to learn about communication, social interaction, social agility, because it ain't going to change.
Yeah. And one thing that does change, though, is based upon the environment that you're in,
Yep.
it will change. So one of the things that when I'll have people that will speak to me and ask questions about business and stuff like that online that are coming from the strength and conditioning world or the personal training world or whatever that is, a physical world, and then they want to build a brand online, is you're in a different world now. Right. So as a strength and conditioning coach or a personal trainer, it's like, thanks, coach. Just those little tiny things that the athlete might say as they leave, a fist bump or whatever it is, all that is gone. All right. It's gone. Right. So and as a physical coach, you might have 10%. Like another coach says something that pisses you off. So 10% of your time is this negative. But for the most part, all the other 90% is, hey, thank you for that. Just in the hallway, it's like you give somebody a pay raise, thank you. All that's gone. Right. So it flips. So now what happens when you go online is 90% of it, if you let it, is all negative.
Yep. Right.
No likes. No comments. That can be perceived as negative, right? Or then the DM that's calling out something, it's all negative. Very, very little thank you, fist bump, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it flips. So it's work then to be on that end, to be able to remember there's a purpose here. Because now you're actually living a more blind purpose.
Yeah.
Until you actually get around people, you do a conference, you do a mentorship, you do a seminar, and they're like, holy shit, people actually appreciate this.
Yep.
Where the internal drive or your purpose, your drive, whatever this understanding is, it needs to be really strong if you're going to go that route.
Spot on. And that's one thing that it was like, we embrace imperfection. I was like, all right, conscious coaching is going to be a conversation starter. Then we put out an online course, then another one, because we wanted to have different mediums that people could interact with stuff as well, workshops and all this. But to your point, this is what helped me kind of work out the holes and the imperfections and all that. You're practicing a craft. How is that any different than a musician sitting in there and being like, we got to do another take. We got to do another take. So yeah, it's like, if you're putting yourself out there, the level of clarity of thought that you have to continue to refine, rehearse, reiterate, refine, rehearse, reiterate is just strengthened. Where if you don't do that, going back to that Joe Harry window, you're just creating a larger, unknown window. You're not actually realizing what your full potential or the clarity of level of thought. All you're doing is sending out errant, maybe if you're sending out errant tweets, but to put these into a product, to put these into a thing that people can touch and manipulate, and now it's theirs. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's a completely different level of mastery. And it doesn't mean that it's perfect. And I actually think that, when we put out our next book, and I'm not giving real percentages here, half the people shouldn't like it because it should make them uncomfortable. Half the people should love it because it's what they've been waiting for. Mm-hmm. But I can't appease anybody that's like, oh, well, conscious coaching didn't talk about training or exercise. Well, yeah, the book said it wasn't going to. You mentioned environment too. And I hopefully this is of value to your listeners. When you think of some of the biggest things that drive human behavior, like what makes people, environment obviously is huge, right? And that's perceived environment. Yeah. We had an athlete that one person thought was really difficult. The reality is he had a lot of injuries and strength training in college. So the weight room wasn't perceived to be a positive place, right? When I got him out of the weight room, even if I took kettlebells or things like that outside on the turf, even that little of a change helped his engagement, and that just was what it was. You all can also look at the billions of dollars spent on casino design, where there's research that show as they pump in ambient odors that can increase slot machine usage. So we all know environment can alter behavior, and we can give more examples if people want. Social factors, who's whispering in your ear? We very much are we are influenced by the people around us and crowds and behavior. One thing that we hate one moment, we see a lot of other people start to do. We're like, okay, maybe we'll go over there now, or, let's say somebody doesn't listen to you or I. Well, who can we look at that does have their ear? And how can we laterally influence that person ethically, right? Which is what we call a coalition tactic. I'm engaging somebody else to help with that. Their drives, which we mentioned in brief. Human perception, which by and large, two people will never. Perception is a sensory oriented experience. So nobody will ever have the same perception. And that's influenced by our education, our background, our habits, all these things. There's some people that think Little Caesars pizza is amazing. Yeah. Just because their dad took them there, right? Or they met their girlfriend there or whatever. And in the meantime, somebody that's got a 1,000-year-old oven from Sicily is going out of business, because somebody else didn't perceive it as good. And then timing. And I think timing, other than environment and social factors, is one of the biggest. Like,
it's big.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there a time in your life, and I know this kind of putting you in the spot, but where you just felt like, even for you, whether it was a message or whether it was your affinity for business and business strategy or just anything, where you're like, yeah, at the end of the day, timing was the biggest thing that made me see this. I probably wouldn't have been as open to it, but then, just whether something happened in your life or something, for some people, technology might get easier for them to use or understand. Like, when did timing play a role in your life where you became more open to these concepts and topics and far beyond just powerlifting?
I think as I've gotten older, the wisdom's a weird word for me to use, but I've become more open to what the pitfalls are. Right. To where when I was younger, I had no pitfalls. Right. So I can probably find video if I go back far enough to where I would probably say I'm one of the best in the world as far as the development of maximal strength. Right. What bullshit that was. Right. But I believed at the time, as more adversity, right, comes, that perception changes, but I think that it's when the adversity comes to and what mindset you're in when it comes to you. So some little things can be perceived as really big, and vice versa, where one of them was, to me, everything's timing, right? So I can there was a certain period of time where somebody told me that I was a dick, right? Which probably I was. I mean, I most definitely was, but people have told me that way before this time. But this time, the timing of it and the situational aspect of it created a lot of introspection that I would never have had otherwise, where probably a decade before, the same type of thing. When I was young, running the stairs after wrestling practice, I got beat all the time. And a coach asked me, and my mom was late picking me up, so I just run, just to kill time. But I was tired of getting beat. So what are you running? Why are you doing this? And I said, I'm tired of getting beat. And all he said was, if you work harder than everybody else, you'll never get beat again. That's a timing thing, right? Because that still resonates now. I was like fucking 11. I was not very old. That could have been said because the lights were, that could have been said an hour earlier. And so timing is a big factor. I think coaches need to understand sometimes it's just one sentence like that can change the trajectory of it did for somebody's life way down the line, and you don't know, right? Yeah. And going back, the other aspect of that, go back and tell those people, that had that impact that they did. Because when I did, they didn't. Mm-hmm. They had no idea. Yep. And it's like, man, that's led. And then you look back, this, and this. But where the mind fuck starts is when it's like, what if he said it like a day earlier? Yeah. And then I'd be like, just like, I suck. No matter what I do, it's just not enough. It doesn't work. Yep. So the timing is a really odd one for me. Yeah, well, it's a good answer, especially because you look at this and it goes back to our misinterpretations of some people just saying, well, this person's just this and this person's just that, and they're lazy with their communication or introspection. One of my favorite quotes is, don't expect the truth from people that lie to themselves. And there are certain people that no matter what you do, at a certain time, they ain't going to hear it.
because they're still in a period of their life where they're lying to themselves, whether they're doing that unconsciously, right? You think of like Goodwill Hunting, things like that. And sometimes it's just going to be like, hey, it is a timing thing. I know you've used a wide variety of tactics. I know you've tried to get them in different contexts and environments or whatever. You need to stay with it, and you need to play chess, not checkers here.
Yeah.
Because it's a timing thing. Don't expect the truth from people that lie to themselves. And life sometimes, which is what happens when you leave the house, right? Life is the only thing that can cure it for those people. They have to have this inciting incident, or because the other reason with that is people are most likely to be convinced by ideas they believe to be their own. They are. Like, I'll say that again. People are most likely to be convinced by ideas they believe to be their own. But if they're lying to themselves and the timing's off and all that, that triumvirate doesn't come together and your message is lost. But it's still worth stating, which is a question I get sometimes. Well, is it even worth trying? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because the most two impactful words anybody can say, or two of the most impactful, is coach said. And that will come back at some point. That will come back into their kind of, what's the word I want to use, orbit of like, oh, that's what they meant by that. It is worth staying in the pocket, don't you think?
Oh, most definitely. And it's worth really taking some time to understand this too, because it could just be as simple as complimenting somebody on something that they did. You know, you could do it right after it, but what if you waited a little bit more, and then based upon the person, it may be more well received after at a different time. Like, hey, you remember when you did, this, completely different, to where it depends upon the person, depends on timing, a lot of different things, especially with athletes, right? So you start to deal with high-end athletes, they get a lot of compliments, right? And a lot of, I call them like backhanded compliments. People don't really mean it, right? It's just like, so they start to think, is this real?
Yeah.
Right. But it could be, but if the person delivering it timed it at a different time, then it's going to be so much differently received than this is somebody just trying to position themselves for a relationship where they can ask for something later down the line. So and see, that would be an influence tactic, right?
100%.
That could be perceived from that person. That's what this is, where maybe it is an influence tactic, and that's why they're doing it. But if this is why I'm saying even non-leaders need to understand what this is, because they may authentically really want to compliment somebody, but they do it at a specific time that they're going to think, this is just blowing steam up my ass.
Yeah. Well, and this is why we say communication's a minefield. If you were to break down all the components of communication, timing is one piece, your message is one piece, the individual nuances of the stakeholders. Are they a 13-year-old female from Tunisia, right? Or a 29-year-old male from Toledo, Ohio? But you look at timing, you look at context, you look at the medium, right, that you presented it in. A message is fundamentally different when sent over text than it is face-to-face. There's no fewer than 11 different factors that influence that. You said something earlier about self-awareness. Another tactic that can help people with these kinds of things is simple as day, video yourself. This is something we do as well. We video people in these role-playing scenarios, and so much humility. I would imagine that you've had this experience a lot too, and I'd invite you, I'd love to learn more. Like just videoing yourself. I joke that I have just the right amount of self-hate, because I'll video myself or I'll hear myself in audio, and it's brutal. But there are so many coaches, and then they want to say that they can't, and this is more coach bullshit. You absolutely, I've been in both settings, can have a release form that says, hey, we're doing something today as a staff development where we're trying to improve the way that we deliver and the way that we, listen and decode and just give you a better experience. Not all of you have to be on, but if you wouldn't mind today, just signing this release form, get it approved, whatever. And it's been approved. I've seen it approved in the collegiate side and the private side, and we do it in our business now. And you just say, this is for us. You get individual mics. And if just once a month, like talk about bare minimum, once a month, you and your staff get together and watch some of this video or at least review audio, which you can do on your iPhone, absolutely free. And then just use an evaluation, and you could use ours, you can use one that you create or whatever. I think it needs to be thorough, and say, where was I with this? What did I do with that? My God, I didn't realize how I might have came across when I said that right message, wrong body language, or vice versa. But just videoing yourself. Have you ever videoed yourself in that capacity?
Oh God, yes. And it's easier now because I've done it so much, where it first started when I was doing presentations and seminars and stuff like that. And it wasn't so much the long clinics because it's a little bit different. But when it came to presenting at like a Swiss symposium or something, or NSCA or any of those things, and it was a tactic too, because it's like, I'm not as smart as these other people that are presenting. I'm coming from this different angle. I'm going to be perceived as the meathead from West Side. I know this coming in, but that also demands attention. So it's not a bad thing because it's going to demand attention, but what comes out my mouth is going to be a different thing.
Yep.
So what is that going to be? And then what's the presentation? Then you film yourself doing it and like, oh God. All right, that didn't work.
What did you notice? Like, what were some of the, I know this is going back, but like, what are some of the nuances and things that you just, and you're like, oh my God, I can't stand that. Was there any tick or anything? There's a lot of that, lack of confidence. And
how
did that manifest itself? Like, what did that look like for you? Lack of confidence, looking down, was it this?
Talking in circles, right? And I had a misunderstanding of, yes, the audience is only going to walk away with 3 things, right? And normally you need to reiterate the main points over and over and over. I was doing it way too much, right? Circling back to that main point over and over and over to the point where it's out of the story now and it's just repetitive. So that was a problem. Too much shit on my slides, right? So the slides, I became too consumed with what's on that slide. I have to cover every single thing. And then it would trim the slides down just to getting the slides down to just simple words and then images that displayed the emotion of what a dynamic effort method, I think at one point had a cheetah, just something up there. Then I used that just as my gauge. And then I just spoke like we're having a conversation and then took that after filming it and made it a little bit more concise because it was too long. And then was able to chip it down. And then from there, keep in mind, there's Toastmasters and there's other shit I'm going to at the same time. And then it's like the gesturing. What's the gesturing? Is the gesturing matching what I'm trying to do? And a lot of this is exhausting at the time. So anybody that's watching this, yes, it's exhausting and yes, it's work and you're not going to get it all right. But if you can get some things right, and Toastmasters did help because it is kind of the role playing and stuff like that. And they had no idea what strength training, dynamic work, any of this was. But the filming those were some of the big ones there. And the gesturing was kind of a little bit more difficult because the bigger the room, the bigger the gesture is. Smaller the room, smaller gestures. So that was a little bit different for me to really get a grasp on. But having that confidence of the organizational set to know that, because the time freaked me out. It's like you got 50 minutes.
That's tough.
Then I got the timer on my laptop. So here it's like, fuck, it's like, and without practice, you're going to be all over the place. And I'm like, if I can at least finish early, then I can do a Q&A. But running late shows lack of preparedness on my part. And there's a big part of me that I didn't want to disrespect the person who asked me to come by not being prepared. So there was that part. And then I also saw it as an opportunity. Like most of these people that are going to get up here and present are going to be just like my college professors. They're going to be boring as fuck. Nobody's going to care about what they're saying. This is my opportunity. So at the end of the day, if there's 20 presenters, I just want to be one of the top 3 that they remember. I don't even care if they remember what I said. If they just remember me, then it might lead them to come to the site and for a long time that was the case because nobody would prepare. They would it was like they were professors. Here it is. And just going to with them. I'm like, I don't even want to go to these things. They're terrible.
Or some people that would present, they'd spend the first 15 minutes thanking everybody that, I want to thank all my mentors and my family and this is why I do it. And you're like, I love it. But like we're here to see this.
And that's a skill too. Presenting is a skill. All these things are skills that I don't think people give enough pause to think about.
No, well, and so I wrote some things down as you were talking because, as I mentioned at our workshop, we have an evaluation for these things. And so to kind of center this, and we can go as deep as you want, the nice thing is you don't have to be perfect to like be an effective communicator. You shouldn't be. Like there's going to be a perceptual gap. So how there's some things like the FMS where it's like, you got a 21 or whatever. Like when we evaluate people, that's never the goal. What we look at is, let's say we're looking at a Likert score. 0 is like awful. It's non-existent. And I'll give categorical examples in a minute. 3 is, yeah, that's contextually, that's what that should have been given the constraints you have, and so let's say you got done presenting and you were like, all right, in terms of just orchestration, the flow of my presentation, right? That name says a lot in and of itself. Was it streamlined? Did it flow? Did it seem like there was relevance, and synchrony, and all these kinds of things to it? I give myself a 1. Well, somebody in that audience probably gave you a 3. Because they were just happy to see Dave Tate. Yeah. There was a lot of information, right? So what we worry about is not a perfect number, but we look at what is your own bias. So at the end, if you were role playing at one of our workshops or you presenting, we'd say, Dave, quietly evaluate yourself on these categories. You do it. Everybody else evaluates you. So we get egocentric bias, which we all have. Now you get peer bias. And then before any of us share our scores, we come together as a group in pods and you get group bias. And then you'd go through and say, all right, gave myself a 1 on this. Here's why. A 2 on this. Here's why. And then the other people have a chance to say it as we see it. And that's valuable now because now it's people sharing tactics, strategies, perceptions, and we're having talk around talk. And in a polarized society, to understand why other people perceive things is really important, right? So, some of the things I even thought about, you're like, well, I could have gotten the message tighter. That's clarity. Okay. So you probably would have given yourself a what? 0 to 3 on clarity.
Well, the first time, terrible. What is 3? Bad 3 or good?
Is like, this was very effective based on those
1.
Right. So you'd give yourself a 1. Let's say disfluency, stutters, stammers.
Well, probably the first time a 1.
A 1.
Yeah.
Right. And then kinesics, you said you weren't gesturing much. What would you give yourself?
1.
Right. So we evaluate these things, and there's so many other one. But now let's say this: your use of questions. Right. Did you ask the audience a lot of questions?
Back then?
Yeah, during your talk.
Hell no.
No, one, you shouldn't have because you were paid to talk, right? Yeah. So some people would be like, well, he didn't use a lot of questions. He didn't ask a lot of questions. Wouldn't that be a 1? No. You'd get a 3 because you were paid there to give a monologue. And so this is what I mean is the nice thing is we don't have to worry about good, bad, this addiction to high numbers or whatever. We now get to work on a range.
No, I see what you're doing. Yeah, I get it.
So we start to, because if you think about it, it's really hard for people to want to work on communication or do it if they have no reference points.
Yeah.
And if they have no way to talk about it. Like I know there's numbers involved in training. There's numbers involved with business. By giving numbers to this perceptual gap of communication, you can better assuage this okay, I felt like I bombed here or I was ineffective here. Somebody else might be like, hey, Dave, honestly, the detour you took there in that part of the talk where you gave yourself a 1 in orchestration, I thought was a 3 because that hit home. And you might be like, shit, all right, that's content for future use. So the point is you've got to get people talking about this stuff and having interactions about it. Even something like disfluency, even if somebody was evaluating our conversation, to say that we should never have uhs, stutters, or stammers is ridiculous.
Oh, it will be there for sure.
Some of those things are functional because what it means is there's cognitive processing going on. And if you say, that's saying, hey, there's information coming. Give me a second.
Yes.
Now, if it's just riddled with it, Dave, that's another thing. But even something as ugly, not great term, but even something as ugly or seemingly non-functional as a disfluency has its place in driving relatability and also allowing functional communication to take place.
Well, definitely. Because now if I'm interviewing somebody, they're on the podcast and I hear, I know what the is.
Yeah.
So then I process, could I have asked that better?
Yeah.
Is there a different direction to go down? So all these things is communication, right? It's just, I want to say basic communication, but it's not because it takes work to be able to figure these things out.
Yeah, well, it's a skill. And remember, some of these things are part of some people's brand. We like certain actors or musicians because of a certain tonality. Or there's a comedian that might be really funny and he delivers in super fast pace and whatever. So what is contextually ineffective for one person, given what their job is, talking on a podcast or talking to a university, can be very effective for another in a different context.
Yes.
And that's nice. Nobody's saying, hey, study communication so you become a robot. No, study communication so you have this bandwidth, just like people's genetic bandwidth in terms of strength and performance and whatever. You have a bandwidth. You need to become a more effective or agile version of yourself. And to do that, you have to train it. What do you think happens when people, so they'll act something out, they'll score themselves. We'll rewind the tape and we'll say, score yourself again. what do you think happens to their scores once they've watched the video of themselves? Do you think their average score goes up or down?
Are they changing anything, or are they just watching the same thing again?
Yeah. So imagine you and I just got done role playing, and we're kind of role playing right now, right? We're doing this. Now imagine we cut this, we went back and I was just like, hey, Dave, evaluate yourself right now cold.
Yep.
And now go back and watch the tape and reevaluate. So that scenario, it's the same thing. They're just looking at it through the looking glass, so to speak.
I don't really know the answer, but I would guess if it was me, I'd probably score myself harder.
Most people do, right? Because you see that and you're like, because our memory is fallible. So you're already an achievement-based person who's kind of hard on yourself and you value the craft and doing really well. When you're confronted with that same messy reality again of, oh shit, I did that with my eyes, right? You score yourself harder. But that's okay. That builds self-awareness. But that's also why you want to have that discussion, because some of the biggest values in the blind spots, and some people probably loved your presentation because they're like, they had maybe built Dave Tate to be this and this and this, and they're like, oh my God, he's a human too.
Yeah.
And that person probably made a $10,000 purchase that day. So that's a nice thing. There's freedom in that imperfection. There's freedom in those flaws. Point is just manage them. Manage them. It's part of the deal.
I would put out there too, because it's one thing that I've done since the very beginning is survey your people, and with that becomes bias too. When you survey them, make sure that your questions are not biased towards the answer that you want them to be.
Yeah.
Which that took me a
You're going to have bias though, right?
Yeah. But how I ask the question when I send the survey, I just had an event this past weekend. I'll send the survey 3 or 4 days later. If I send it right immediately after, the scores are way higher. We
send one immediately after day one of one of our workshops. Hey, what is he talking too fast? Is he doing this? There's specific questions. Yeah. And then I'll adapt my delivery to a degree. Day 2. Now there's some things, some people want us to give them day 2 content on day 1. So you'll get some credit. I just want to get to this. Okay, well, I'm not going to show you the end of the movie before we're at the beginning. Yeah. That stuff I won't look at that much, but if they feel like I'm going too quickly or this or that. But 100%. I think, the main thing is just getting people to be situationally aware, introspective, giving them a tool that they can utilize to say, this stuff is objective and subjective in and of itself. But I'll tell you, one of the biggest aha moments for us was there was one coach that was trying to be more assertive. Assertiveness is a category we score on as well. They want to be more assertive. They want to be more clear in their message. They want to be more direct, all these things. Well, after she was done with the scene, one person in the group, the workshop had given her straight up 0s and 1s, just obliterated her. Other people were like amazing. And she was a trained communicator. She was really sharp. I would have given her 2s or 3s on just about everything. Well, the 0s and 1s weren't because the other guy thought she was shit. He was from Spain. And he goes, culturally, what we view or what I view, especially in the household I grew up with, as assertive and what you demonstrated was not there. Yeah. He's like, so I saw Western assertiveness there. I did not see what I would have considered to be assertiveness in and so somebody could say, well, who cares? Well, don't you think you're going to deal with people in different cultures and backgrounds? Yeah. So it's good. She was like, oh, that makes sense. Well, let me see how you would do it. And he could jump into the role-playing scene and do it. And she was like, all right, I wouldn't do that. But I like the way you said that right there. Cool. Another tool in the toolkit. So you see, if you're just not, how do I want to phrase this? If you're somebody that is just willing to go back to the beginning, learn how to interact, poke some holes, be introspective, get a new language, and throw yourself in a situation, you're going to come out of that better. And why are we so much more comfortable doing that in every other area of our life and not the area that predetermined or, influences our relationships at such a tremendous degree?
Well, there's the caveat behind one of the big drives that I've had with the whole company is I would see these people that, could smash all-time world records on a platform, but then they couldn't use the same skill sets, the consistency, just all these general skills in their own life. Same thing with how a lot of people could communicate within a weight room, their comfort zone. There's a reason why I have the podcast in the middle of a weight room, right? It's a much easier
environment.
And for the people that have spent their whole life in a weight room to communicate in the weight room, because that's what they've done. So it's way easier than if I put it in a conference room and had it there. But being able to transfer, as you just, into a different realm.
Code switching.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's really kind of the same stuff, just in a different environment. But the environment it freaks you out, and the audience can change. All these things change, but a lot of the base stuff is there. And I think people get so intimidated with things that they shouldn't be because the base is there.
Well, that's why we call it social agility. It was no different when I train an athlete that maybe understood change of direction or how to do a drill a certain way. But the minute I bring outside constraints, music, or I create a different open-ended aspect of it, or even I remember we were doing one competitive drill with a bunch of NFL guys, and it was a rookie versus a veteran, and this rookie, he could lean on the fact his body was a little fresher, he wasn't as banged up. The other veteran was like Leon Hall. He had been in the league like 9 years at that point in time, but I remember I had all the other guys circle up, clap, start barking things, start just creating noise, and noise is representative of many things in our life. It was actually auditory noise. For us, it can be self-doubt. It can be fear of criticism. Noise comes in many factors. But right then, we started to see the veteran take hold. When we created more constraints, more noise, the veteran who had been in more scenarios, right, was able to overcome some of the physical advantages that the rookie had because he could block some of this stuff out. And that's intra-individual as well. That's not always going to work. That depends on that person's upbringing, or whatever, or have they been exposed to a drill like that? But when I wanted to make things harder, I mean, think about when people are like, oh, turn this song on, I want a PR. I'm like, no, you got Frank Sinatra, Fly Me to the Moon. That's what I'm playing. Enjoy. Just mess with people and mess with yourself, and that's all these things, whether it's role play, whether it's putting yourself in different environments, all it represents is a constraint. And you're going to have myriad constraints in every aspect of your life. So you can't become agile if you hide from those constraints and you let that noise get to you. You just got to, I could have sat here and been like, hey, Dave, I just got off a flight from Australia. I don't even know what year I'm in, let alone what day. I'm going to be judged as a communication guy on the podcast. I'm going to have disfluencies. Who cares? Get on a plane, come up here, let's rap. The good that comes from it is going to supersede any of the bad that comes from me just being like, I don't want to risk coming off as not what I'd like to be there based on the fact that my mind's foggy, I'm not rested, whatever. Who gives a shit? That's how progress is done. You just keep going and then reflect on it later.
I think that's a huge point because to peel it all back, we're talking at the base level of just skill acquisition, right? So when you train athletes or if I'm working with a lifter, at the very beginning, somebody probably might have to show them how to squat, verbally cue them how to squat, then they need to verbally cue themselves how to squat, and then then that verbal cue needs to be somewhat automatic. Then it needs to be automatic under heavier loads. Then it needs to become automatic with speed. Then it has to be automatic in a chaos environment. It's the same thing with this communicational aspects where if people understand this main point, and then when that discomfort begins, adversity, instead of running away from it, kind of lean into it a little bit to be able to build this skill acquisition, the ability to handle adversity at faster rates, or actually you'll become the things that used to drive you crazy 10 years ago don't drive you crazy now.
No.
Why? Because you've dealt with bigger things.
Calloused.
You're calloused. You've dealt with bigger things, and I thrive off adversity. So there's that, right? So COVID times come in, there's like 3 different major things happening every single day. Yes, it sucked, but if I'm being completely honest, it also didn't. Because now it's, this, for me, it was what drives me, a big part of that. But I had to build the skill to be able to operate there. Just dealing with it's one thing. Anybody can deal with it. You make a lot of poor decisions when you just deal with it. But being able to deal with it with logical, cognitive thought and not being stressed because it's adversity. It's has to be acquired, and I would go as far as to say have to be around other people to be able to help you acquire it too.
Without a doubt. And this is why it was a no-brainer for us to create facilitated outputs, because people can read all the books they want, online courses. You actually have to give yourself up to that kind of environment to be around other people. What you just spoke to, skill acquisition and all that, goes back to the very beginning of the podcast where you said, what was some of the defining moments? And I mentioned the hospital, my motor learning degree, all this. Humans are complex adaptive systems. Human interaction is another complex adaptive system. Well, if you think about the context in which coaching takes place or social interaction, that is a chaotic, complex context, right? Like the chaos theory fits very, very well into communication strategy. Chaos theory, like, there's certain things, we don't know what the price of oil is going to be 5 years from now, do you?
No.
You don't know what the price of wheat, because these are dependent on a lot of different things. Relationships between nations, climate, weather, which those are two different things. A myriad, there's so many other things. This is why certain organizations engage in what they call scenario planning, right? People are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to think of all these different contingencies for what might be. Well, the art of coaching is similarly complex. It is not complicated. To contrast it clearly for the audience, complicated, there is an actual algorithm or mathematical formula for it. Like, we know when the next solar eclipse is going to occur. And you can also start to know what cities it's going to pass over. Automobile manufacturing is not easy, but it is complicated. We know how to do that. Complexity is financial markets, the weather, social interaction, all these things. So if we know that communication takes place in kind of chaotic, complex contexts, and that you yourself are an adaptive system, to get the skill, you got to throw yourself into it.
Yeah.
And that's why we use a combination of that role play, like I told you, like real life role play, but we also lean on improv, like theatrical adapted theater games, almost like Whose Line Is It Anyway, which the Verkashansky and whatever of those things is two women, Neva Boyd and Viola Spolin, who created kind of that Whose Line Is It Anyway adapted improv during the Great Depression as part of the New Deal, when you had all these immigrant children coming into America that didn't speak English. And they wanted to assimilate them and get them, build relationships with American kids, because everybody was going through a hard time. So they said, well, how can we flatten the hierarchy? Because they don't speak the same language, but we want to create relationships, common goals, and whatever. Well, they use these adaptive theater games, which at first glance look like nonsense. They're not nonsense. They teach tonality, they teach listening, they teach shared leadership. Even if and I've done it a couple of times on this podcast, you might not realize it, because why would you? I'm insane. We do a game called Last Letter First to work on listening. So imagine I say, how are you today, Dave? What's the last letter there?
V.
E. Dave, right?
Yeah.
You would have to respond with a word that begins with E. Like, well, each day's been a challenge, but today's pretty good, Brett. What's the last letter there? T. Totally understand. Tell me more. So we would work on what looks like an absurd game, but really is no different than what strength coaches do with correctives that don't look like a thing, but actually can integrate back into main lifts. So if somebody's struggling with some form of communication, and beyond a point, that role playing can be really high intensity, analogous to high CNS kind of lifting, because there's a lot of real life there. We can pump the brakes, utilize an adapted improv game to work with them. Like if they're like, I'm always trying to use the right words, so my mind's clouded and my tonality shit. Well, we can play a game called gibberish, which anybody that's ever lived in an apartment building understands. You don't hear what the people next to you are saying, but you hear, So we'll put two or more people into a scene where they're literally looking at each other like, and you've got to respond in that same way. And we'll instruct them how to adapt their tonality if it's somebody that needs to amplify. So people can say, well, that's ridiculous. No, it's not. You fight chaos with chaos. Improv is the ability to adapt to situations in the moment within boundaries. You have to utilize information. The only way for like communication and learning to fail is if it stops. And so you get somebody that's like, well, I think improv's silly. They themselves have now a bias called functional fixedness, where they only see something as that one thing. Like, this is only a water bottle. It couldn't possibly be a doorstop. It couldn't possibly, and creativity is a part of intelligence. So no, you are hearing me say something is ridiculous. As adapted theater games can even be brought in to help people get more comfortable with chaos, to learn a skill, to get outside of themselves, to share leadership. And that can be integrated into these role-playing scenarios. And to cap this off, and I know I'm sorry I'm being long-winded, I just want to make this point. When we had one coach, and not many of them say it, I'll say this. One coach was like, well, this is all make-believe. And I go, right, because you know what's going to happen in your life the next 24 hours, right? You know exactly what's going to happen in your life. And I go, and plus these athletes that you have scrimmage when it's 4th and 1 on the 10-yard line and 30 seconds left, when it's really not. You're in an air-conditioned practice environment and half pads and there's nothing at stake. That's not make-believe. Or a world champion boxer shadow boxing or sparring. That's not make-believe. Like military does war games. That's make believe. People in the medical world, they'll work on cadavers. Or one time during COVID, a gentleman that was on our podcast talked about how they cut the lights in the hospital and the power, and people had to improvise and figure out what to use and all this. All these things, like life is improv. Lean into it. And finally, that coach, when he came, what he realized is he goes, hey, the reason I was averse to it is I don't like the way I responded. You know, frankly, I felt stupid. I didn't make the right decision. And you're right. It's like these people get scared of being judged. And it goes back to that Einstein quote, problems can't be solved with the same mindset that got you in it. So if you're scared to be judged, you're scared to be vulnerable, you're scared to make a mistake, and you're always trying to save face, well, you're not really going to be a very effective leader, are you? Lean into the chaos, lean into the ridiculousness, and try to grow as a human being. And, you know, that's where our differentiation, just like you don't just make equipment, ours is like a million other people can come out and try to do what we do. Our experiential learning and those stakes and environments and review and peer feedback is where we're going to differentiate yourself. And our product is progress because of it.
Yeah.
But you got to step into it because it's hard.
Well, yeah, of course. Right. It all
That's
is.
a skill.
It all is. But hard should be able to become easy. Yeah. I think with a lot of people, they don't want to look at what the potential hard could be, right? I'm a big believer in a SWOT analysis, right?
Yeah.
So strength, weakness, opportunities, threats. When you get to the threats, I don't think people spend enough time thinking about that, right? So that during COVID, that helped a lot, right? Because yes, I have thought through and have not systems, but at least scripted, like what's going to happen if the building caught on fire and burned down? Like these are real things
that can happen
that need to kind of be thought through. And from an interpersonal realm, I probably didn't take that as serious. I probably don't take that as serious. Like that probably needs its own SWOT analysis as well. Instead of just the company, you know, what are my personal strengths, weakness, opportunities, threats?
Yep.
Now the threats I kind of know, because if I don't have an enemy, I create one. And I'd rather create my own because I know all my own weak points.
Yeah.
So then I have to compete with that person.
Yeah.
That
Know how to kneecap yourself.
Yeah. And it's that tooling of that thought process. A lot of people are scared to go into, which makes them, from a business perspective, vulnerable
and terrible negotiators because they never game out.
Yes.
They go into a negotiation thinking about what they want. We had a gentleman that worked with Chris Voss come on, and we talked about this on our podcast, but it was like, if you don't take the time to get to know who you're negotiating with and you don't game that out, like, hey, Dave, I have to meet with so-and-so later today. Would you mind just kind of pushing back on me? I'm going to ask kind of for a raise, and would you push? And we game that out 4 different ways. That's amazing. That's what you want to do. That's what we mean by conversational sparring. And my wife and I will do this if we reach out to podcast sponsors or whatever. I'm like, all right, what are you going to say when they ask this? What are you going to say when they do this? Or if we, no matter what, and we have to do this for our workshops. Mm-hmm. In Sydney, we had issues with the internet, with the Bluetooth. We travel with a ton of stuff. And at the end of the day, I'm like, all right, what if you have none of that and none of it works? Can you teach it without the slides and a whiteboard? And so you have to do these things. I even have to think about, as ridiculous as it sounds, let's say my wife and I, heaven forbid, we get a divorce. There are certain people that would love to line up and just be like, oh, Mr. Communication, human behavior guy couldn't even keep his marriage going, whatever. And I'm like, I told Liz, I'm like, what do you even say to that? And she's like, well, the reality is if that ever happened, the reality is like, you think some people would trust that we made the best decisions that we could and we actually had these conversations. So we think about things as awful as that to as little as, how are we going to handle this interaction? Or podcasting is a perfect example. We didn't script this. Mm-hmm. I'm not scripting the person I interview tomorrow. You give them a range. There's these constraints and you have to dance. It's this rhythm of relevance. It's a give and take. So for people that don't use a SWOT analysis to that and they're not willing to engage, how do you become a better negotiator, partner, listener, facilitator, anything, let alone coach?
Yeah, and this is where people don't get it. This isn't just business because you got to negotiate if you'll buy a car. It's
life's a negotiation.
Yeah, and it's that power thing. We'll get into that. It's that people see that power thing, or I'm a fan of Robert Greene's book, so people will see that and be like, think that now I'm like on a high horse, like I want to try to fuck you using all these laws of power. And I kind of want to know what other people are using, what other people incorporate, and it is influence, but it's still it's the world we live in. It's not this world that everybody you're going to run across is like this going back to this for the athletes bullshit, right? So yeah, okay, I get it. Right. If that's what they want to say, how can you be for the athletes if you're mentally fatigued and stressed and exhausted?
Exactly.
You can't, because you're fucking burnt out. Right. So if you don't take care of yourself first, you can't be for the athletes, because your own health is for shit. You can't keep up. You can't stay on your feet. You can't think.
Yeah.
You can't be the best coach for them. If your family life is for shit, then you're stressed out. You can't communicate. If you can't communicate well with your own family, how are you going to be able to communicate with the athletes? So it's like a hierarchy. You got to take care of yourself first, then your family, then maybe for me, it would be business third, but if my own house isn't in order, I can't take care of my business. So that is, I can say, yes, it's for the customers. And it is, as long as those things are in line. If they're not in line, I can't be for the customer.
Right.
If they're not in line, I can't be for the athlete, because I'm not the best I can be for the athlete.
Yeah.
So it's not really for them. You see what?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance and lack of self-awareness. And this goes, just on the burnout. You would think that our field thinks that there's a memorial for fallen strength coaches.
Yeah.
And burnout, the research, and there's this woman, Christina Maslach. She does amazing. She's done a half century of research on this. People say that burnout is like, oh, well, you're not in it for the right reasons. If you're burnout, you're not grateful. No. The research makes it clear. Burnout impacts people in highly social professions that give their all. It actually impacts the brightest amongst us. And that's why they named it that. She said that. She's like, you see it in social work, you see it in the military, you see it in the medical, you see it in highly social professions where people are often asked to give more than they receive, and there's three parts to it. There's emotional exhaustion, there's cynicism, and there's a sense of inefficacy. And so, yeah, it's like, we don't talk, that's another topic people won't talk about, because it's like, oh, you're not in it for the right reason. No. Actually, this all coincides to the issues we have when we can't communicate, negotiate, we don't understand business and all these things, but we're these go hard, try hard people. What do you think is going to happen? And then to your point, yeah, you're for the athlete. No. It's all wrapped in that exemplification, impression management bullshit tactic of you just want to be perceived because the strength, you know what? The number one thing strength coaches actually covet? Social rewards. They want to be known as one of the best by their peers. Strength coaches covet social rewards. To be known as a true blue, to be known as a guy that gets it, to be known as this and this and this. They covet that. They want acceptance so bad because there's no objectively way to like just purely manage, their effectiveness. Well, guess what? Welcome to the world.
Yeah.
My father was a financial advisor for over 40 years. Yeah, no matter what the gains and losses ratio or whatever, and there's a great article too about a company that pays a law firm. They were like, it was about this idea of what is value and the subjectivity of value. One company's like, we bill over $10 million a year, but you know what? We don't win every case. We know they're going to pick up the phone. They have this referent power, that's why we use this law firm, is because they pick up the phone, they're relatable, we know they're going to do the job. It's not about wins and losses. So it's where are your priorities when this need for validation is so much that you'll go to all these lengths to speak to the collectivism, we're never burn out, just this ideal of this strength coach, when in reality it's just like, man, we all have a need for acceptance, but you just got to and by the way, if I'm talking to you, you shouldn't feel offended by it. It should be an aha moment. We've all had it. We've all had it. But yeah, I mean, hands on, like if you learn about these things a little bit more, you can mitigate that and you can call yourself on your own bullshit. That's one of the main advantages being in that hospital did for me. For a year of my life where you're in this day room where you don't get to choose what you watch, you're not able to read certain things. I can't go to the bathroom without a nurse standing there and collecting everything that comes out of me and all that. You have a lot of time to sit there and be angry and think, the first part of that, I'm pissed at my parents for putting me there. The second part of that, I'm pissed at all the nurses and doctors and all that. The third part of that, I'm like, all right, I've got to figure this shit out. So to have to ask myself these hard questions and be isolated like that at such a young age while observing other people as a master in human nature, specifically my own. And we had Robert Greene on. That was an example of when people say don't meet your heroes. I'll say that dude's as advertised. I was worried when I told him about the work we're doing in Power and Influence that he'd feel some kind of way. That dude was like, I love it. you're trying to operationalize these concepts to a new level, I'm all in. And that was just so refreshing, because that in and of itself, like you said, people perceive that this guy wrote this awful book, how to take advantage. No, he's for everybody. Just, hey, figure out this stuff. It's the hidden language. We say it's the hidden language of the world. It is. And it'll help mitigate a lot of these things.
So as your education now, you're working on your doctorate in power dynamics.
Yeah.
Right?
So essentially the doctorate, our workshops, and my next book are all linked. And I did that. I'm an idiot, but I did that because we had to collect. I was already getting into the weeds way deeper than conscious coaching on these topics. Social agility, influence, all these kinds of things that we could kind of only hint at there. And plus there were a lot of things I didn't know. So that's still, there we kind of talked about archetypes and drives. We've grown a lot. So going deeper and also pushing this to a broader audience. So anyway, I was going into that research already. I was already creating these facilitated outputs as part of our business, these workshops where people can come work on it. And Sophia Nymphius, who's a tremendous researcher in the agility space, goes, why don't you get your doctorate? And I'm like, because I'm not insane. And, I run a business and whatever. And she's like, you can probably get credit for some of the work you're doing now. So I reached out to some folks. John Kiley is the guy that oversees it. And he's like, your data collection, you have over 1,000 points of data collection. You have all this stuff. This is no brainer. It should be a doctorate. But then the tricky thing, like you mentioned earlier, is the code switching. The doctorate has to be very academic. And admittedly, there's so much data, we kind of had to shrink it down and focus the lens. So the doctorate's really going to be mainly on the impact of communication skills training on coach development. So within that, like kind of assessing collectively our workshops, our online course and all that, did that make people more effective communicators across a variety of contexts, right? The book is getting into the non-academic weeds of here's how you operationalize this in your everyday life. Because that's not the point of a doctoral dissertation. Yeah. That's to say, hey, we started off to see this, if this was feasible. There was an absolute need. There's nothing in coach development like this, even though there's been tremendous calls for it. We're going to do it. We're going to road test it. We're going to see what worked, what didn't, how that aligned with coaches and all this. But the book is the broader, all right, we're going to teach you the rules of the road. And that's tricky in and of itself because, like I said, the publisher's like, you got 300 pages. Mm-hmm. And inevitably there's somebody that's going to be like, well, I want to know how to use this and that. But yeah, they're all tied together as this trio so that, education informs practice and practice informs education. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What's one of the things that worked that you didn't expect was going to work? Because it had a bigger impact than you thought.
Within what?
Within that power dynamic. So earlier you said there were things that you didn't know as you started into this.
That was like, there were just topics that I didn't know about when I wrote Conscious Coaching.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but I would say one thing just to talk on a need that you and I have both expressed, wanting to see the ability to understand power at a level so that we could operationalize it so you don't get taken advantage of again and all that kind of stuff was the biggest thing I didn't know was the synergistic relationship between power and influence. So just work with me on a second, okay? I'll outline a case study. Yeah. The number one question I get now is, why won't this person do this? Or I have this boss that's this, or I work for this coach that's this. Well, the first thing, when I ask for more context, almost nobody gives it to me, because they just want me to give them some bullshit answer. Yeah. But if they do give it to me, I'm able to see a misfit pretty clearly. And the example is this. Let's say you and I work for a company and we're peons, right? And we're trying to influence our boss to give us a bigger budget, all right? Well, there are certain power bases that we need to leverage. Let's talk about what we can't use right off the bat. Okay, there's a form of power called legitimate power, which is it's everything to do with your position in the company, CEO, director, whatever. So if we're peons in this hypothetical scenario, do we have legitimate power over our boss? No. So because we don't have legitimate power, there are certain influence tactics that are not going to work. Like even rational persuasion is limited. Going to our boss and trying to use logic as to why he should do that. Yeah. Beyond a point, right? He's not going to listen to us. Conversely, let's say our boss really likes us. We're still peons, but we have referent power. He likes us. Well, now, if I use that same tactic, rational persuasion, is that more likely to work on somebody that already likes us and we have a good relationship with? Yeah, because if they like you, they're going to listen to that, even if we know logic by itself doesn't impact behavior. Let's use another one, right? Now let's say somebody's like, well, I want to look at the example that I give here. Let's say expert power. And expert power is defined by French and Raven. It doesn't have to be degrees, anything like that. Are you perceived as an expert, right? There are some people that believe the Kardashians have high expert power in just about everything. Therefore, the amount of influence tactics they can use is infinite compared to somebody that doesn't have that perceived expert power. You can think of it as absolute strength to other training qualities.
Yep.
Absolute strength feeds even things like endurance, even things like hypertrophy, right? It pours into that cup. Your power base is equivalent to absolute strength. You've got to choose the right power base, of which there's 7. We've simplified it from French and Raven's research a little bit. And once you've identified that power base, sorry, I'm manhandling your stuff.
That's fine.
Now you say, what influence tactics can that feed? So, and I can give more examples if you want. I'm just trying not to be jargon heavy.
Yeah.
But so we were able to just help people. And I'll give one more case study. See, like, oh shit, I was using the wrong gear for the wrong hill. You know, I wasn't doing this right. Here's an example to just codify this, even if I did a poor job explaining it. Woman reaches out to us, real client, works at a naval base, says, my boss hates me, but I need to go through him to get approval for something that we're trying to enact in my division. And her division was related to HR, staff development, things like that. And I go, well, why does he hate you? So I start getting information, and this is part of the framework that's coming in the next book. Well, you know, he's been in the military 40 years. He's 76 years old. You know, she starts kind of outlining what, you know, is one of those guys. They're like a plant. They're a part of that. And doesn't really like women. Doesn't like women at all. I'm like, all right, well, you know, what have you tried? And I don't worry about giving her the nomenclature of the power bases.
Yeah.
I just want to hear her. Well, she's like, I've tried showing him the budget. Okay. Between you and me, that's rational persuasion. You know, I've tried appealing to his self-interest. Okay, that's an exchange tactic. I've tried to, and she goes down this list. I go, well, but didn't you say he hated you? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, well, a lot of the things that you're asking for, you tried, are based off reciprocity or him at least recognizing you as a peer. That ain't working. And she's like, well, frankly, what will work? And eventually I said, listen, who does have his ear? And so she starts outlining, you know, 3 or 4 people that does have his ear. And I go, well, what about Diana? I'm making the names up, obviously.
Yep.
She goes, now Diana likes me. Great. You have referent power with Diana. Here's 5 influence tactics that you can use. What else do you have with Diana? She's like, well, you know, Diana sees me as an expert in this area. Great. Then that just bolsters some of these influence tactics that work with so you start creating these roads, almost like neuronal connections. It's like, hey, you can leverage these 3 power bases that collectively amplify this tactic, this tactic, this tactic, go that way. Because even if she's like, well, I have that relationship with Paul too. Well, let's go to the numbers. You have more power bases with Diana, and that allows you to have affordances, gives you more opportunities. Diana's the clear winner here. Go through that. So people can do this in their personal lives. Like my dad is a great example. He's got diabetes, spinal stenosis. I have referent power with my dad, right? He loves me. So an emotional appeal is going to work better than me just giving my dad the facts. He's had all the facts.
Yeah.
And he knows I'm an expert in some of that stuff, right? Relative to like what he wants. But logic doesn't work with my father. So I don't give up on my father. I start being like, hey, Dad, Bronson turns 3 this year. I'd really like you to know him, you know, when he's 15. Take care of yourself. And if somebody like, well, that's manipulative. Damn right. So is manipulating volumes and intensities and your spending and everything else, but it's manipulative for an ethical means for that. So that's kind of the relationship that helped me map these things out, because people talked about power and influence and persuasion as separate things. They're not. They feed each other, and nobody teaches you how to program that if we're using our parlance and strength and conditioning.
Yeah, and that's a huge fucking thing, right? Where learning with the people that are saying that was manipulation, right? The kickback on that is they're already doing it themselves.
Exactly.
Right?
You do it anyway.
Yes, there's a huge part of this that's just part of the natural being of being human.
Like eating.
Yes.
But you still got to look at it and audit it.
Yes, but to be able to define it, here's what it is. Like as you just described, here's a path that won't work. That does not mean that there's not other paths that will.
There's always.
Right?
Lateral strategies.
But to be able to put terms to that, paths to that, basically Legos, right?
Yeah.
Legos to that people can see. This is actually how you got this person to agree to this.
Yep.
It's maybe how that person got you to agree to something. And you just think that it did naturally happen, but it can strategically happen when thought out if you know the different paths, and they most don't.
No, and just like you said, we already eat, we already sleep, we already do a lot of, but we're working on ways to manage that. You know, like, yes, you already do these things, but most people have never had the space or the ability or the language to sit and say, put a name to what happened, and then to try it in real time. Because even the people that listen to this podcast or read the next book and they're like, I got it, I'm going to tell you, oh yeah, come on and try it at one of our workshops. And by the way, it's not a workshop where nobody laughs at you. Nobody laughs at you. It's like, oh, Dave, you messed it up. It's a practice field. And unfortunately, we do have to like consolidate it to 2 days. If we had our way, it'd be 4 days. And we get that nobody becomes a master in 2 days. And that's why we call it the apprenticeship.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to be that Hemingway quote, right? We're all apprentices in a craft we'll never master. But I'd turn and ask those people then, well, then how else are you going to practice it? And this is the problem, is we have this society, and education's great, but like they do think there's a difference between experience and exposure. People think that just because they've heard about something or read it that they know it. You don't. You got to do it. It's like when Sully landed the Miracle in the Hudson. He's like, somebody can be in a flight simulator. That's not the same as flying a plane with 250 souls on board or whatever. So the goal is for people to kind of read this, put a language to it. You know how if you, like, we don't see kind of the carbon dioxide that cars emit, but if you put on kind of thermal, you can, right? We want people to be able to kind of see this stuff. So it becomes the matrix to them. And now you can come practice it. And that should scare people, but they should also know that, like, that's good to be scared. That's okay. You don't think athletes are scared when they compete. You don't, like, there's a difference between like functional anxiety and all these things. So yeah, I think that, and the other tricky thing though, Dave, around that, where I do sympathize is these researchers, a lot of them didn't really make themselves accessible, you know? And so when we were trying to kind of tease this out to make things more accessible or just easy for the listener, the reader, they didn't make it easy, you know, and they're just like strength coaches, so worried about arguing. Like Robert Cialdini will use persuasion synergistically with the word influence. Gary Uckel will say, it doesn't become persuasion unless influence was successful. So we cut out a lot of these semantics. Yeah. You know what I mean? And now the trick is writing a chapter on this stuff and doing all these pieces. But you do it anyway. You've got to manage it. And I got to be careful how I say this, lifting, which I still appreciate. You can look people in the eyes and be like, you don't even have to agree with it. I guarantee you 1,000% this is going to impact you in your life. And this is going to either, it can be the thing that costs you your reputation and results, or the thing that saves you a lot of time and struggle. And then that is another reason why, you get a chip on your shoulder, you get fired up because you're trying to save people from the mistakes that you made. You know,
well, on the flip side of that, every commercial that they're inundated with is that, right? So the news is that, you know, other podcasters can be that, you know, a lot of these things, if let's say that they think that this is all unethical, right? I can't use any of this, even though they do, but they can't. Then you can at least learn it to know when it's being used against you.
That's the point.
Against is a poor word. When it's being used towards you.
Yeah.
Against makes it look more combative than it really is. But it is. It is. And then you can watch, because that was part of this rabbit holes of any topic of debate. Doesn't matter. If there's a topic of debate in strength and conditioning or anything, and this I quit doing because it's fucking exhausting. Like, here's the topic of debate. Here's what they're debating about. Okay, they're full of shit. They're full of shit. Now I need to go look at the source. Yeah. Now I got to look way down into the source. Okay, well, this is what they're saying. It's not even what the source said.
No, well, and look at this. You look at collegiate strength and conditioning now. You know, you look at the landscape. For anybody that thinks they're already good at this or communication or anything, well, remember, these things change rapidly. You look at the strength and conditioning landscape. They used to be able to have what's called a legitimating influence tactic, rules, policies, and procedures about how athletes could wear their hair, earrings, this and that, whatever. Now, right, you can get bite back from that. Like, there are a lot of people that are like, hey, you're no longer, ADs will say you're no longer to tell athletes how they can wear their hair, this, that, whatever. Like, this stuff has been in the news where somebody made an athlete cut their hair. Look at this. It was a referee. A referee made an athlete cut their hair. And then that athlete came back and sued them and was like, yo, Like this was a cultural thing. You know what I mean? Like you're making me cut my hair just to be able to compete in this tournament. Now there's certain things that for sure that are non-functional in the weight room, like earrings are a risk or whatever. But my point is these people are subject to this, whether you agree with it or not. Your AD is going to give you rules and you're going to have different constraints put upon you and you're going to have to manage it. It's the same thing to certain strength coaches that, as we were talking about earlier, I don't put myself out there in this and this and that. Well, now that's starting to work against a lot of them. You know, you have certain strength coaches that are accused of certain things. And guess what? They don't have a body of work where they actually put their views out there on a wide range of subjects publicly. You expect the public to believe you?
Oh, shit. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. And so when I was told, you're not supposed to have a brand or whatever, listen, I hide in plain sight. My views are out there, good, bad, and indifferent, and I'm not for everybody, and I know you aren't either, and I make no apologies for that. But I'd like to think that if something comes up in the future, that there's going to be some people that are discerning enough to be like, time out. We've heard him comment on this subject. We have that, and who knows, there'll be deep fakes and all that other BS.
Yeah, I know.
But like there are some coaches now that are realizing like, ooh, I don't have the benefit to keep my mouth closed. Even more reason to be trained as a communicator, because you can't be silent now and then expect everybody to like give you the benefit of the doubt. That's not the world we live in. The social landscape of today's world in leadership has fundamentally changed. We no longer, I don't even know if we want leaders. We kind of want scapegoats. But
yeah, that's a good.
We've never lived in a time of where like more power savvy, and we call it power literacy. You better become power literate. You better become socially agile. Otherwise, don't complain when these things get done to you. And none of us are foolproof from it. You know what I mean? But better arm yourself.
At least, yes, exactly. At least know.
Yeah.
Right. And that creates that vulnerability that's frustrating to me, because when you try to get people to look into when I try to get people to look into these things, it's your book is going to help tremendously, because then I can say, go here, right? Where I send them, they don't want to read it. They don't want to do it. They don't want to basically do the work, or they don't think it's true. Right, which is another
which
weird.
Would be crazy to me. What's not true? That communication's not important, or that there's not a skill to it.
Well, that people aren't actually trying to find ways to use influence to their not against them, but to the best advantage of whatever the party is that's using that influence.
Yeah,
this is not new. This has been this way forever.
Yeah, well, if people I would invite those people to look into the leadership literature. The leadership literature, pretty much no matter who you look at, as long as you're not grabbing something that's cited by two people, but like the larger leadership literature, the foundational leadership literature defines it as a process of influence. Leadership is defined as a process of reciprocal influence for people to meet shared objectives. And no matter what derivative of that definition that they get, they're going to find it comes back to influence. And this is out there. And this is kind of what we found that we have to reteach is, like I said earlier, we don't teach people so much about lead with communication. We talk about what is effective coaching, what is effective leadership, because that was another inciting incident, like me asking, was I even a good coach? And going down this rabbit hole of saying, all right, well, what defines effective coaching started to intersect with what defines effective leadership, because leading and coaching are guiding and teaching and mentoring and all these kinds of things. They're social processes. Well, social processes that are embedded in influence. So people can, if they just go into the literature of it, it makes it evident. But we think that we're listening to these voices that make leadership seem like this sing-songy, asepticized kind of thing where people just listen to you. Well, that's still influence. It's inveterate. Influence is in every part of your life. But I would challenge anybody listening that doesn't think that to look at that. And by and large, look at this too, how it's baked into our life. There are certain people, when I get contacted in the outside of strength and conditioning, they look to me for that reason. They want an outside hitter to come in. They're like, we don't want somebody that's like us. We want a subject matter expert in this space. And it's great. You provide a unique perspective based on your sporting background. Well, that works the other way too. There are some people that would never read my work or listen to my work or whatever because they see me as competition in the strength and conditioning space. There are some people, like I said earlier, that they didn't like me just because of my age. But what if I had written that under a pseudonym? And history has plenty of examples of this. If I wrote that under a pseudonym, or if I was a 48-year-old strength coach with 4 Super Bowl rings, now would certain people have read the book that didn't read it because I was 30 years old or didn't compete or wasn't coaching in their environment. And so that in and of itself shows that, the people that we are influenced by, the people we relate to, the people we buy products from, the companies we trust, all of these things are all part of the influence process. People have to get their own feelings out of it. Their own feelings are usually tied to their past experiences with it. So they think because if they were outplayed in a game or whatever, if somebody took advantage of them, influence is bad. Look up the number one. If there was a third party here, I'd say open your phone, go to Google and read off the number one definition of the word manipulate. You know what it is? To wield or handle an object or tool skillfully.
Yeah.
The secondary definition is something else. So meanings aren't in words, they're in people. To consolidate everything we just talked about within the last kind of 30 minutes, meanings are not in words, they are in people. So how I feel about influence, manipulation, power, all that, people are not actually taking an informed and real life view of these things. They're internalizing it and projecting it based on their own insecurities and expectations, because the research makes it clear so that's the task of the next book, to write this anti-leadership book. It is that, like literally the preface is, if you've ever felt that you've tried, these morning routines, all this stuff, this servant, all this shit that you're told to be, and it just hasn't worked when you needed it most, and you got screwed and outplayed and whatever, this is the book for you. Conversely, if you're somebody that still thinks it's about just energy and charisma and traits, as opposed to the enactment of certain behaviors in certain situations in an agile way, becoming more contextually intelligent and power literate, if you don't believe that, this book is not for you. So I've got to write this anti-leadership book that subversively, but in a good way, gives information on communication, power dynamics, and all that. It's tricky. It's tricky to do, because then you got to not get pulled into the weeds of, somebody could say, I critique a lot of leadership models in there that have perpetuated this false belief, the things that we believe. Somebody could be like, well, you didn't talk about this theory of leadership. This goes back to what you said then about certain people that don't create content. I have an editor that says, hey, Brett, you've got to get to the point. You don't have time to go into the 28 models of leadership. Yeah. What are you trying to say? I'm trying to say what we've been told through pop culture of what an effective leader is, leadership models that have kind of been streamlined to just talk about traits and all this other stuff, and all these other things have perpetuated this idea that, like, I've got to be some squeaky clean, perfect person. I'm telling you, no. Embrace your dark side if you want to learn how to operate in the gray, but there's an ethical way to do it for those that want to keep reading. But you wouldn't believe it, Dave. The publisher said, the tricky thing is most books now that sell well, that make New York Times, Wall Street, all that, are books that people, and they have data to prove this, are books that people can typically read and digest in a day or two, and that don't challenge their thought process beyond a certain degree. So, I already know this next book likely won't be a bestseller, because I'm not just telling them everything is effed, or I'm not giving them a simple motivational message. I'm asking them to think. I'm asking them to say, like, where, you've gotten screwed over, or these things didn't work. Here's some reasons why you might be the problem. And I don't mean that offensively. I want to re-educate you. And if people like Robert Greene and Annie Duke and that can get on board, and people like yourself that are, kind of had a lot of miles in this game, you'd like to think some of them can too. But the problem is are we breeding a society that doesn't want books like that just want kind of quick books that are like, that was nice. Next, so I can tell everybody, yeah, I read a book a week.
Yeah, I have two ways to look at that way, where maybe we are, but maybe it's always been that way, but we don't know, because we got a bigger lens to be able to see things through now, right? Where with social media, it's still not the real world, but it's still. It's a bigger lens than 3 TV channels, right? Yeah. So has it always been like that would be the first question that's in there. And then let's just assume that that's all true. What if you're the 10%, right? Because this is the message I would have more for the younger people and I don't know, people when I was coming up said we are all fucking lazy. Every generation's been lazier than the next generation. Well, what if you're the 10% that's not lazy and you're willing to do the work? And then as time goes on, you're going to be the ones that have more power, leadership, whatever you want to be able to define that as, success, whatever it is. Because if 90% of the people that could be your potential competitors are no longer a competitor because they just want to be lazy and have the easy things, then what an opportunity for the people that want to work.
No question. And that, I love that you said that, because we've talked about that with our own SWOT analysis. We're like, all right, who could kneecap art of coaching metaphorically? We're like, all right, somebody could come and they're just social media stars. They have all these content creators. They're not actually teaching a lot of this stuff, but man, do they make it look like they are? And they're kind of dumbing this stuff down. And we know, and again, all due respect to him as a businessman and what he's accomplished, but we know that there's a big market for simplified stuff, because you kind of get the Tony Robbins stuff and things like that, right? We're also like, all right, there's also the academic, somebody that could come in and be like, well, we think we got that covered. Like, we take an informed view on this, informed but not snooty. Like, we are going to ask people I want to pay homage to the researchers that did some of this stuff. Yeah. So I'm not going to change every name. We're going to ask you to learn a new language. Big deal. But that was another reason of getting the doctorate, is just kind of saying, like, we're not bullshitting you here. We're trying to mix, we're road testing real life, but also inform practice with these kinds of things. Then we think about, all right, well, we know we could have just stuck in strength and conditioning. And this is a big one, because we got asked that a lot. Why did you not? Because this works for us and against us. There's some people that think art of coaching must mean sport. There's other industries that no. There's business coaching. There's all kinds of coaching. So we know that but if somebody just wants to teach this in the context of strength and conditioning, by all means, you can have that market. We're open to strength coaches, physical therapists, we love the fact that, like, when I went to workshops, and I wonder if this was the same for you, you'd see that it was pretty insular. It was almost all strength coaches or all this. But when I'd go to workshops for other professions, there were a lot of these things. Yep. So we opened our workshops and we said, we love nothing more when there's a director of performance next to a firefighter, we had an FBI forensic analyst next to this, next to that, next to that. So we say we cap it, we make it small, so we give people a lot of reps. Somebody else could go big. That's fine. You can have that. We want people to have a lot of reps, a lot of feedback, a lot of discussion, a lot of practice. We want a lot of different perspectives. It was great when we saw, just to give an example, we were going through one of those evaluations one time, and there was this gentleman that worked in the NBA over 20 years. And he was given a 1 on one of the categories by a 19-year-old personal trainer that worked at 24-hour or whatever. And that individual, the director of performance, goes, well, no disrespect, son, but I've done this for a long time, and while I appreciate your feedback, I don't think that's relevant in this case. A woman that was a part of a Fortune 100 company, their HR stood up and goes, now time out. What's the average age of the people that you work with? And he goes, 19 to 24. And she goes, do they know the things that you know? Are they subject matter experts in those things? No, ma'am. Why do you ask? And she says, well, it would seem that individual over there who's young and doesn't know what you know, as you just pointed out, could be an ersatz version of the very population that you coach. So why would you discredit his feedback to you? You know what I mean? And all of a sudden, because this is influence at play, because that came from a different person, and they had really gelled over the workshop because he was very interested in leadership and she had experience at big corporations. He all of a sudden second thought and he was like, you're right. Looked at the gentleman, looked at the kid and said, I apologize. That wouldn't have happened if a woman like that wouldn't have been there. Because she was outside of the performance field. And he said this, he goes, I didn't perceive it as a threat. You're right. And he's like, I learned a lot about myself and my biases and my insecurities just through interacting with people of other professions. But the point being is just like, we want people that want to think, that want to do the heavy lifting, that don't want the sugar rush, that want to stick to their ribs. But I'll be honest, that still is a pain in the ass, because there's all these other people out there you still want to help, but you've just got to double down on who you're for. And I don't think anybody knows that better than you in this context. No, I mean, when it comes to just communication in itself and sales, marketing, all this stuff, with all the things that I went to in the performance realm, that is why I went to the Tony Robbins thing in the first place. It's like, this is not helping me with my business. Yeah. Right. I don't need to know sets and reps. This is not doing shit. Then when I started going to, e-commerce events, business events, the Tony Robbins thing was just the thing that really, oh, wait a minute. Yeah. No, there's business stuff. There's other shit here. Yeah. There's other shit here. Like these drives, this makes sense. Business there's some other shit. On. Like then where do I go to learn more about that? And then it was like, there is a huge disconnect there. Giant disconnect, because once you start getting in those other realms, everything is some way or another tied to communication, influence, all the power, all these different aspects everywhere.
not there, which is fucked up. I don't know why, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
Where I think that all those, the other thing too in that realm is some people stay for a long time in there. Most don't. Most stay for a short term. They're like, get fed up with it, then they go someplace else.
Yeah.
And then welcome to the real world.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it goes into, again, coach education. Per the research says, most coaches learn to coach by either coaching the way they were coached or trying to emulate the tactics of what they perceive to be a successful coach. And why that big gap of that 285 coach development workshops and so little interpersonal skills, they make it clear. They're just like, listen, most of these things have been targeted towards what people perceive to enable success. And that has been an updated weight room or new technology or new this, when in reality, there's a lot of people that no, it's an understanding of the human side of it. And that's the thing. Like, I am not saying that being a better communicator is going to make your life easy. I am saying that I want to make this very clear. I am saying that nothing is guaranteed to make your life and almost everything in it worse than being a poor communicator.
Oh, most definitely. But I know many examples of this, that you take somebody that's in that strength and conditioning realm, they leave, then they open up their own sport and conditioning center, then they get all pissed off because Jimmy down the street has a better relationship with his clients, but they don't have the relationship with their clients, but Jimmy doesn't know shit about training.
No.
Well, maybe Jimmy needs to learn more about training, but at the same time, maybe you need to learn how to communicate and market a little bit better. Yeah. You now walked into that world where nobody gives a fuck about what you knew there. No. What they care about is, can you communicate what you know to them? And that goes back to there's no second string. Yep. There's no third string. There's this one person that you have right there. And a lot of them do start to understand, but they're always frustrated when I talk to them. Sure. Always. And it's like, dude.
Well, let me ask you this, and I'm going to, a little bit of prologue to color it so you get where I'm going with it. To that point, there have been accidental market segments that we didn't expect as we did this. So we started off teaching about power dynamics, communication, whatever. Probably one of our highest grossing things for our business right now is helping people with business and marketing. Like, we say this internally, and I'll say this on your podcast because you get it. Like internal language, I looked at my wife and I go, it's interesting. In a way, we are kind of like this intersection of a therapist and also a marketing agency, or we're like a strategist from a communication. But there are people that will, and I didn't realize it at the time because that wasn't the intent. But after I started sharing, we created an online course because people were like, well, how'd you kind of go out on your own and do this? And I'm like, well, that would be an interesting exercise to reflect upon. So I went back and did that. I created a course on like, all right, here's how we did our business strategy. Here's how we marketed. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of people were like, hey, can you help kind of evaluate my marketing and my messaging and my this? And at first I was like, do we want to do this? But then I started looking around. I mean, remember, Nintendo used to make playing cards. Tiffany and Company, used to make stationery paper. I'm like, we need to be open to this. So now we do a lot of business consulting and mentoring and all these kinds of things. And it's a blast, and it's helped us see the intersection even more, and the healthy intersection, business, marketing, relationships. This is where we sit. So when our vision statement, and as you know, the vision statement is supposed to be the big audacious goal. Our vision statement is to change the way the world interacts when it matters most. And that is in business, to get your product to somebody. That is in relationships. That is in coaching. The question in all that long-winded nonsense is, did you find that in Elite, like this accidental market segment where you're like, all right, we started doing this, and then wow, this evolved. And I'm not going to say you didn't see it, but you maybe didn't expect it to take off like it did, or you were pleasantly surprised. Was there another arm that grew?
Not another arm that grew. The arm I thought it was ended up not actually being exactly what it was.
Really? Tell me more.
So where, there was a lot of typecasting, stereotyping what the business was in the earlier years, because Louis did help with the business. So it's all powerlifting, it's all multiply powerlifting, it's all this competitive powerlifting stuff. And then, as the target's always been people who put training as the top 4 priority. I, for a long time, began to think that they were all competitive lifters. They were all, that realm, that's what it was. They were all strength and conditioning coaches at higher levels, and that's what it was. And even while I kind of knew that's not what it was, I didn't know the exact significance of what it really was. Where once years go by and we start peeling things back a little bit more, it started to become more of, these aren't competitive lifters who are our customers. They're people that just fucking really like to train.
Yeah.
These are not the professional and high D1 strength coaches that are buying. They're the high school strength coaches. These are not what I thought it was. And then as time went on and then different metrics became available, the open powerlifting is one open source metric of all competitive powerlifters. And they've done a good job of going all the way back, to 70s even. And so we exported that database and compared it with our customer database, and it only made up 5% of our total revenue over a whole decade. And I'm like, whoa, shit. I would have thought, even now, I would have thought that would be way higher.
Yeah.
These are the competitors, right? But the bigger market, which I've always known it because it's still always been top 4 priority, are the people that love to train like a powerlifter, but not compete. They love to train like a bodybuilder, but not compete. They love to train like a performance athlete, but not compete. That is what became, this is our market.
Yep.
Where for a long time, I thought it was just that, right? So all the marketing was targeted just here.
Yep.
We need sponsor lifters. We need this. We need this. We need this. That wasn't doing shit. It was breaking even at best.
Yeah.
It's like who are the main people? Here's that main market. And then it was segmenting that off to, because of the way the company is structured, it's complementary content provided by people who buy the products that we sell.
Yep.
And so then that all of a sudden, is this scalable to the degree that I thought it was? I've learned long ago, no, it's not. But those people that actually give a fuck enough about the content that we put out are enough that have kept us in business for 25 years.
Yeah.
The bigger chunk of that market, the market that we keep trying to build into and customer acquisition, is to be able to expand that so it can actually grow, bigger than what it is, right? To be able to get to that a different level from that without compromising who that main market segment is.
Yeah.
So that was probably the biggest part where I always knew, but I didn't know with certainty, because that's the thing in business that's really hard sometimes, is how do you know for certain this metric is exactly what it is?
Yeah.
Right? Because now you're dealing with analytics that maybe a marketing company is giving you or somebody else is giving you, and they're padding it and it's bullshit and it's not really what it is. And even is Google Analytics even true? So you're trying to compare.
And trying to interpret all of that is tricky because you can get a lot of false positives with things.
Yes. So you're trying to figure all that out, and then bam, this is pretty simple.
Yeah.
Like, here's the names of these lifters. Here's the customer database. Boom, cross-reference. Shit, that's not what we thought.
Yeah.
But that's okay because it just confirms what I kind of already knew.
Yep.
But that was probably one of the bigger ones. I'm trying to think of other ones that were like off segments. Not really. I've probably had some, but years prior did not take the opportunity to explore it. Too focused on one certain aspect where that would be a fault that I had, where something I work with other business owners when I speak to them now on not doing, because those opportunities are there and you have to explore them instead of like, fuck that, I'm not doing that. Yeah. Which is what I did. And it's like, shit, would that have been, you don't know.
Yeah, no, it's tough. I mean, and it's funny because this continues to just harken back to everything we've talked about, even when you look at how you've marketed. Know yourself, know your audience, know your context, know your tactics, and see what comes from that, and then iterate that again. And on our end, an example of that is, this is why when you asked me at the beginning, you're like, are you still training athletes? I had to make a decision not to do that because there were other parts of our business that the data was saying I needed to explore. Now we have people, like, if I was to use loose terminology, I'd say people come to us when they kind of, we help them with a messy reality qualities of leadership in life. But what that's manifested on is, all right, we have somebody who once was like, would you ever do speaking? Because they had done Toastmasters, things like that. But they're like, I want something a little bit more, it teaches me kind of some of the psychology behind these things, also gets me the reps, helps me craft something, gives me a lot of feedback. And I was like, well, at the time we had something called Brand Builder that was helping people understand the use of a lot of this stuff in branding and business. We had the apprenticeship, which is more conflict resolution, negotiation, all those things. And I was like, do I really want to do that? So we ran a beta. We did it. We said, hey, we're thinking about putting 10 people together. This is going to be 2 days. You're going to get a lot of time to practice this, refine this. By the way, this is not just for like professional presenters. This is if you have extreme social anxiety or you do this for a living. And so we explored some of the, like, to explore speaker school or brand builder or this, I had to say no to something. And that thing was easy, not because of I didn't like training athletes. I still love that. But it was, you start to do the math and it was starting to feed in more and more to any kind of misunderstanding. Like there were contracts that we missed early on because somebody still saw me as a training guy in their language and whatever. And so I was like, all right, I can't keep dipping my toe in all these avenues. Like this is the company I want to build. Coaches and leaders and this intersection between, all right, there's people out there that'll motivate you and people out there that'll scare you. Well, somewhere you still need to know what to do. Yeah. We want that. But yeah, I think that's been an interesting thing for us. And then managing the staff with that, because some of my staff would roll their eyes and be like, we have so many events to run this year. And I'm like, well, yeah, we got to explore this shit. We need data points. We need data points. And that's been a tricky thing to solve for too, is helping, a young but experienced staff realize that, hey, we're just like there's overreaching, overtraining. There's going to be some things that we've got to explore. Yeah. And we're not going to say yes to all of it. But I also don't agree with it. Just do the one thing.
No, you can't.
You can't. The people that tell entrepreneurs and everything like do one thing, I think is so misleading. That's why I want to get your thoughts on that, because I know there's bias.
You have to always look at other things. When I look at the other things, what I'll look at is what's the worst possible outcome if we do this. Like we all know what the potential upside could be, but the odds of that happening are very low, right? So what's worst case scenario? Like if this is going to be a 12-week thing, what's it going to cost? And then when it's all done, if it sucks and it doesn't go well, what's left over? Do we have things that can be repurposed? What is there that has value if it falls flat on its face? Yeah. And then what is that value of those pieces of whatever's left over? If that's how I make the deciding factor. If that pieces is worth exploring that path, I'll explore it. Now, if those pieces of whatever this is not worth it, then I'm not going to explore it. Yeah. And there's a certain degree of loss you're willing to take for that too. Yeah. So if that's going to be this giant loss, it's different. It could be, let's say it's just a product that we bring in. It could be a product that just doesn't do well, doesn't do what we need to do. But then can I sell this? Just to clear it, can I sell it for what I paid for it? Yep. No, like fuck. Then this might not be something, worst case scenario. If I can't even sell it for what we paid for it, then it might not be worth bringing in, because so those metrics, but they all have to be looked at. I can't say this won't have the opportunity.
Well, and there are some things that don't sell right off the bat that then all of a sudden get hot. When we were doing market research early on, it was probably 2018. We sent out a questionnaire to almost like, and this was when we were we're serving a bigger majority of strength and conditioning professionals, but we sent out a questionnaire that got about 1,000 responses. And it was just saying, what are your pains, fears, hopes, dreams, strengths, weaknesses, all this kind of stuff. And by and large, people were kind of saying, hey, I feel burnout, I feel stuck, I love what I do, and they could answer anonymously. So you got the real deal. Things that strength coaches really struggle with, but they don't ever want to say out loud. So we created an output for that. And it was a course called Valued, like value education, because there were almost all of them, when you do the Typeform word cloud, were people being like, people don't see my value. Yep. So we created this course and we put a lot of money into it, masterclass style, visuals, all that. And at first we were like, well, that kind of bombed. And then all of a sudden COVID hit.
Yep.
COVID hit, and people that, I want to do my own thing, but I don't want to be disloyal to this organization or my school or whatever. All of a sudden people start getting canned. All of a sudden people start realizing like, oh my God, yeah, I do need to be honest and look out a little. I can't lie behind this facade anymore. Then sales started to hit. And I'm not saying it made us millionaires, but you absolutely saw return on investment and then some. Goes back to what we talked about with timing, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
I'm like, okay, so that's another tricky thing is you experiment a little bit, but you can't go into like whatever that data comes right away. You got to wait a second. Just like with training, fitness fatigue, if we were to look at and assess the value of training, well, it depresses physical capacities at first before you get any long-term super compensation. Business can be the same way.
Yes.
So trying to tell my staff sometimes, like, we're going to try this and we're going to look at it as a beta. And don't look at it whether it didn't hit. Let's assess it 6 to 12 months. Or what we do is with the apprenticeship, we ran it 10 different ways at first, and we got a lot of data. And then we're like, all right, now what do we want to change? What do we want to give a facelift? But of course, everybody's got to have what Annie Duke would call kill criteria. And you also don't want to get into sunk cost fallacy and whatever, but you do got to give it time because the data sometimes lies at first, wouldn't you say?
Yes. Oh, yes, most definitely. And there's other things that you need to know when to kill.
Yeah.
Right? There's some things you become emotionally attached to, and it still comes back to this. Now we're talking about internal communication, same thing, where you got to ask yourself, is this only still here because I have some emotional attachment to it?
Yeah.
And then am I aware of that? And it's like, shit.
Can I ask you this?
Yeah.
How big, and this might be the wrong question because I'm naive to all aspects of your business structure, but how big is your marketing staff or the staff that helps you kind of analyze this data, sell this stuff? Like
That's like me.
That's
right?
you.
Yeah,
Okay.
So there's like maybe 12 people here total.
Okay.
Right. So the most might be 5, 7 we had at one point in time.
Do they all have marketing? Sorry to interrupt. Do any of them have marketing backgrounds in data? So you're all kind of self-taught with this stuff?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So I've been looking for a CMO for about 2 years.
So they all want hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Well, even with that, they don't have the skills that I need. Right. So even with that,
what are those skills?
Well, they have to know the industry. Right. And then they have to understand digital marketing for real.
Yeah.
Right. So not just this.
Which is a moving target.
Which is definitely a moving target, and so some of these people will act like they know all this stuff. And then you ask them if they can just make an Instagram post. They'd have no idea what the fuck you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because they might have been CMO someplace else, but they've had other people do all that work. So then you're almost looking for a unicorn, in a way, but at the same time, you can't bring somebody in that doesn't understand media, marketing, and the industry.
Right.
I mean, those are three. That's why they would be paid what they're going to get paid.
Sure.
They have to have that without faking it, and because they have to. Basically, it's for me to remove myself from that part.
You have to. Right? You have other jobs. You got to fire yourself from something.
There's other things I want to lean into more, and things of that sort. So that now you're dealing with email marketing and all this other stuff. And I made a couple mistakes as far as people I brought in for those roles that, on paper, definitely had it, but when they came to doing it, it's like they didn't.
Yeah.
They no idea, and so it's. Figuring that out, that's a whole other thing of business.
Well, I was just bringing that up because that's some of the hardest coaching I think I've ever done is managing a staff that inherently doesn't have that background, but then saying you're going to have to learn these things.
Yeah.
And I understand that some of you don't like this part of the job or that part of the job, but that's what enables the parts of the job that you do like.
But with that, you don't have the other parts.
Right. And so, finding this intersection of being this new age boss, right, that makes sure that you have psychological safety and everybody feels empowered, but also the reality that like, hey, parts of the job you got to do, and to the outside looking in, it can look like I'm doing all the things that I want to do, but I have parts of that as well, and if I'm not doing it now, I did it then. And it's just interesting to manage that because, we've looked at bringing outside people in, and as like you said, it's almost harder to teach them, well, here's the company culture and here's this and here's the audience. We had somebody one time that worked with an individual, and I won't way different field, right? Kind of in the love space. And they were essentially the chief of staff. And they're like, oh, I helped this person build $100 million business. And they came vetted through a lot of channels. Like it was legit. And they're like, this was back when I was still doing everything myself. And eventually it got to the point where they were so surprised that we couldn't just put out products that were going to be $5,000 to $25,000, that they were like, well, I don't know how to do this. Your audience doesn't want to pay, $15,000 for a weekend in Bermuda and this. And I'm like, no shit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Which part of the onboarding did we not cover that in?
Yeah.
But don't make the mistake because she was trying to say, well, this isn't a viable business. I'm like, don't confuse the two, right? And she taught me lots of great things as well, right? This sounds like a contentious conversation. It was just a long-term reality that it wasn't a fit. But that was one of my lessons on, you can't just always bring in an outside hitter, but then you bring somebody inside. And even if you incentivize them appropriately, whether that looks like commission or equity, you have to manage kind of the life thing of like, they might be like, well, I just had a conversation recently. Well, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. Okay, well, let's figure out this. Let's figure out that. But also understand that without this, even if you want to teach it and do more of the coaching around these things, your capacity to bring real life examples in and real life experience is going to be limited because you're kind of choosing what you just want to do right now.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
Yeah.
Then the majority of my good stories come from the shit that I didn't want to do or deal with.
Yes.
And so anyway, just staffing is kind of all I mean is staffing seems to me, and I think a lot of people is just like, that's one of the hardest forms of coaching, but where a lot of this communication stuff comes in, full stop, even more so. I wanted to see if
100%, especially when you're a smaller business, because people have to wear multiple hats.
Yeah.
Right. And then if you bring somebody in, then the hat changes a little bit.
Yeah. Where
one thing I was told very early on through a mentor that I had was, even when it was just like 3 or 4, and I've abandoned this, but since then, because other things I found worked better, but it worked good then, is everybody had position statements, but they were multiple position statements. So if somebody was handling, say, HR, sales, and editing, right? Then when we would grow and we'd have to hire somebody, and I would take those position statements and say, okay, here's the 3 positions that you're doing. We have to bring somebody else in because everybody's overextended. Which one do you want to run with? Right? So now if they would have picked, sales or market or sales, or let's say it was sales and content.
Yeah.
Right. So you understand that if I pull the sales away, right, then I give that to somebody else, then that's somebody else's entire position. So they're handling everything with that. So nothing on this is going to move to this.
Yeah.
Right. Or if you want to go sales, then you understand you're doing nothing with the content at that point.
Yeah.
Right.
You don't get everything you want.
Yes. But what this avoided was them, us just hiring people to take the low-hanging fruit that nobody else wants to do.
Yeah, I can't do that.
Because then that ends up being a shitty position over a period of time for whoever takes it.
Yeah.
Because then they're just like gopher, right? Which may have a point at some specific period of time.
Yeah.
But sometimes it became difficult decisions for the people who were with us at that time. Like, well, do I want to do this or do I want to do this? Because I kind of like doing this part of this and this part of this.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's what it is. You have to make that decision from there.
And I think another thing that illustrates just, or hopefully compels more in the strength and conditioning professional to seek outside education and build ancillary skill sets, not hobbies, like true ancillary skill sets, is, I have friends in other fields that they're able to end up hiring some of their former audience or customers that were like, well, I was a former CMO at Nike, or I was a former CTO at this and whatever. It becomes a little harder to do that in strength and conditioning because a lot of people haven't diversified their skill set.
No.
So, and they've been wonderful people. So I'll qualify this. We've tried bringing people on that were like, hey, I do a little video editing, or I've done a little marketing, or I've done a little of this and whatever. And then they come and you beta test them and you're like, well, yeah, no, that's not a fit. But that's what always drove me nuts about the, like, how I built this podcast. You try to hear how other people built staff. And I remember they were talking about like away travel. And this woman was like, oh, well, I had a friend that spearheaded Amazon's logistics division. And she decided that she'd just come on. That doesn't happen much.
No, that doesn't happen much at all.
If it has and you're listening, by all means, we're looking at Art of Coaching. But it's made hiring a very interesting thing. And so then you say, okay, well, we just got to make our development better then. We've got to make our development better, and we've also got to play the long game. We have people that can go out and teach for us because we don't have, it's not like when I worked at Athletes Performance where I had all these interns, and you might develop a relationship with that intern and then that somebody becomes a potential hire. We don't have a physical hub at AOC yet. We're working on getting a compound and all that, but where we mainly interact with our audience outside of digital is our workshops. So what I've told my wife is like, listen, as we get more facilitators, those work like satellites. Certain people are going to stand out at our events. Those people come through. We have a facilitator program, which teaches people a lot about our business. And by the way, they ain't all going to pass it. There's an upfront investment because we're taking 3 days to train you. You're not all going to pass it. But I think some business owners, and we've learned for us, we've just got to play the long game a little bit more because that's what our context demands. We don't have an audience that we can kind of necessarily hire from that's got all these skills. We don't have an intern pool that we're getting to see full. I don't want people hanging out in my house all the time. Yeah. So you got to find what works for your model, and it's a road, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It is. And it doesn't get any easier.
Yeah.
It just gets different.
Yeah.
Right. So the challenges are always there. It just is what it is. It doesn't, you think it gets better and you get better at it, at certain aspects of it, but there's always something that you don't know.
Well, and how has that changed you as a communicator? Just the process of realizing like certain people are going to take a longer time, or you've got to kind of not dumb things down in the pejorative means, but you've got to make maybe your onboarding a little simpler. You as a manager, it doesn't even have to be as a communicator. Like how have you changed compared to the last 5 or 10 years in that standpoint?
I've changed a lot, but I've also realized that I have a scope within I'm willing to change in. Right. So there's because I have a certain perception just on my physical appearance and how I carry myself. Right. So it's intimidating. So I understand that, so there's where I'm going with this is I have to lean on other people to do some of the communicating for me, and go that route rather than invest more time in trying to become this 10% better in this one area, where in that case, it just may not be a good fit. It may be better just to find somebody else, for that than having to become that 10% better, because it's easier to find that somebody else than it is for me to expand the energy to be able to become that different type of person in that situation when I'm looking at the best interest of the business, right? Because there's the best interest of the business, then there's the best interest of the individual, then there's the best interest of me.
That's a really important point.
I have to operate within the best interests of the business, right? So that also carries down into where I'm going to allocate my time and development on where my weak points and blind spots are. What's best for the business right now. So while I know these blind spots and I know these weaknesses, are they big enough now for the business for that area of focus, or there are other areas that need to be focused on, which are in the betterment of the business?
No, that's a really smart point. And I think it's interesting as I've transitioned to trying to kind of get other staff to handle certain things, there becomes this perception by some that CEOs are kind of insulated. And it's like, no, like to your point, we've got to handle other things. I can't teach every event and do every podcast and do this. And, but inevitably, as I started to transition into a little of this, and our operation's not as big as yours, but people be like, oh, big time now, you're having other people do this. I go, no, that has nothing to do with being big time. That means that I have to write a book that opens up more market segments. I'm doing a doctorate that is the underpinning of the methods that we teach. I'm flying to Ohio to talk to Dave. I have mini jobs, and that's something we still work on and is evolving process, as well as getting certain people, you don't want to use the mafia as a great example of leadership, but they were good in the sense that there was a lieutenant and a capo. And it's like, hey, Allie or Becca or Liz, you've got to get on this person's ass now. I can't do that. And by the way, just because I'm good at that, doesn't mean that I step in all the time. For this to be a functioning business, it's not called bread of coaching for a reason. You guys got to do it. And they welcome that. I think it's been interesting seeing my wife, because we've had to kind of code switch and how do you turn wife mode off? And she is an employee, but she's also my wife and my boss in certain contexts, especially on date night, but we won't go there. But just saying, like, guys, what you might see me saying no to is not coming from a place of privilege. It's coming from a place of, as you alluded to, I've either got to do what's best for the business or something else right now. So please step in and be a good team player. Leadership's about all of us.
Yeah, well, overall, what's best for the business is going to be best for them. right?
Yeah.
So
Getting them to see that.
because that's got to bring in the revenue that's going to be the potential raise down the line or whatever it's going to be.
And there's no time period where that shows immediately.
Yes. Now having being the person that is that and not having self-awareness on where you're supposed to allocate your time is a whole nother story.
Good point.
Right? Because then that's hurting everybody. And then that's hurting yourself and all that for either ego reasons or whatever it's going to be, which plays into that.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of factors that kind of play into that hierarchy of how that fits in there, where the other big part of that is the success of the business is not me. It's the people that have worked in the business, right? So it's never been me. You know, I've been the constant. My wife's 60% owner, actually more owner than I am, and that's been since day one. So I mean, we've been the two, since the very beginning.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that you were business partners.
Oh yeah.
What was her? Sorry, I don't want to stop.
Well, she got in it because her background was in social work. She hated the job, and then just kind of migrated over when we needed that. So basically, handles, I guess you would say, is a COO if you wanted to give a title to what that is. It handles that, but within that whole realm, anything that is ever bad or wrong with the business, it is my fault.
Yeah.
It is my responsibility, no matter what that is. So that's the one thing that I see a lot of business owners can't wrap their head around. The success is not yours, but all the failures are.
Yeah.
That's the way it is.
Yep.
That's just how it is. And but they'll put the blame, on other people that may work for them. Now, if they may not have been trained adequately, they may have not been. That's your fault. They may not have. It may have been wrong hire. It's your fault. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? All these.
They might be incentivized inappropriately.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of fact. They're all fall there. And when you can't take that self accountability, which also comes along with a lot of the things that we were talking about earlier. The things that you're looking for communication wise, and external factors need to be looked internally as well.
Yep.
And if you can't do that, then you're fucked. You're not going to be able to handle it.
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point. And being able to kind of just say, taking that account of this goes back to what we were talking about, the importance of having skin in the game. It becomes really hard to be self-aware if you hide. And if you're constantly casting out those blame and all those factors. But yeah, it's been a journey, and incentivizing, when people feel like somebody's lazy or difficult, it's still just so many times comes back to strategic thinking, strategic communication, being incentivized appropriately, knowing your audience, knowing their drives, understanding your weak points, and my God, like that's why it's impossible, I feel like, for most true leaders to have an ego, because they know where all the bodies have been buried.
Yeah. Well, if let's say somebody's lazy or difficult, where I'm going to go to first, or are they overextended?
Yeah.
That's because usually that's not the case.
Or they I will say this though, sometimes they can feel like they're overextended and they're actually not prioritizing or communicating. We've had instances like that where somebody feels like, well, I'm doing too many things. Well, you could delegate that though. Well, I don't know what this person's doing. Well, call them up. Yeah. You know what I mean? We're a remote, and I'm just speaking because we're a remote team, and there started to be this reliance on like, well, was it our weekly stand up and in Zoom? Was it our strategy meeting or whatever? I'm like, the phone still works. You can call this person. It doesn't have to be a formal meeting. You can say, hey, what's your bandwidth? I need to push this. That to me is where it still comes down to overextended can be a communication issue and a self-awareness on their end. And that's something that is hard as an employer or manager as well. Like, let's say you or I are self-aware. Well, you still got to get your employees to be self-aware. Yeah. And this is something my wife speaks to excellently. She was just like, there's some areas where I just felt like I was overextended and I was buried. And I wasn't communicating. I was hovering. I was delegating. And I wasn't really looking at like my need for control, which came from this place. If I see this company growing quickly, I don't want to mess it up. And right. That's hard to own. If you're me, it's like, all right, well, let's talk about this and let's see where we can go with it. It's good to know I'm not the only one.
Oh, no, you're not the only one. There's a lot. There's a lot. And there's a lot of dynamics there.
Should have your wife on here. We could talk to her too.
Exactly.
She knows where the bodies are being.
Yeah. Were there any other topics that you wanted to touch on that I didn't bring up?
I think the intersection of just self-awareness, communication, strategy, business, marketing, pitfalls, and I would just say how people misinterpret certain things in the industry, right? Because even though we're not a strength and conditioning company, we still serve strength coaches. We still want it to do well. No, because I think you hit on all the things that keep what can be a really special field back if it's just willing to evolve. What keeps really special people from being willing to or being able to have some more progress. Yeah, I think you touched on everything. How about you?
I haven't looked at my notes yet. So I think we covered everything that was in the notes here that I have here. Where can people find you?
Yeah, very straightforward. artofcoaching.com. Whether you're looking for social media, any of those things, artofcoaching.com, not the art of coaching, just artofcoaching.com is the best.
We'll have a link in the description box.
Yep. Conscious coaching is available worldwide on Amazon. A portion of proceeds goes to the Alzheimer's Association and Leukemia Lymphoma. We're always appreciative. And I just can't thank you enough for being willing to dive into this stuff.
No, I thank you for coming out, man. I appreciate it. This has been great.
Yeah.
You'll love the way I end the podcast. We're done.